Hey guys, this is John. So, a bit different of a video today. I was recently messaged by a guy named Kevin, who's the administrator for the Lichess 45 plus 45 League. Now, the Lichess 45 plus 45 League is a standard time control league played at, as you probably guessed, 45 minutes with a 45-second increment throughout. And it's a team league played on 5 boards, so 5 players per team. And they just completed their season. They're about to start another season. And Kevin and the other participants in the league selected 8 games that they think are particularly noteworthy for this season, noteworthy and interesting. And I'm going to analyze these 8 games. They actually hired me to do this, which was very nice of them. A little bit of a paid gig for myself. And they were kind enough to allow me to share this with my channel. So you guys are going to get to see the analysis as well. And I got to say, before I start, they picked some really interesting games. I think their selection was spot on. And I very much enjoyed playing through these games and adding my own thoughts in and trying to get into the heads of the players. So I'm going to go through these 8 games one by one. I'm going to do this straight through. And let's jump right into it with the first game, MrLegilimens versus EsolcNeveton. So this game opened with d4, knight f6, c4, and now e5. Already action on move 2. This is the Budapest Gambit. This is a line that I actually forgot to add to my chessable repertoire, the repertoire for white with 1d4. I think I'm going to go back and do that at some point. But very combative move. Black strikes at the d4 pawn. And it is a gambit, of course, because white can take the pawn, as MrLegilimens did. Black played knight g4. And now knight f3. So MrLegilimens chooses I'd say normal move, just developing and also holding this pawn on e5. Personally, even though I have played knight f3 myself, I think bishop f4 is a bit better. And judging by the stats in the database, this seems to be white's better chance for a small advantage. Then you can continue with like knight f3 and e3, etc. And the bishop will be outside of the pawn chain. Not much wrong with knight f3, but you'll see after bishop c5, e3, this bishop does get locked inside the pawn chain, which is a slight knock against white's position. Although the bishop often does come to life via b3 and bishop b2. So after knight c6, white played bishop e2. Even though the Budapest Gambit is called a gambit, very often black will win back this pawn on e5. If white wants to play for a small edge, as white is kind of doing here, it often makes sense for them to just let black take that pawn, which does cost black time. So white plays bishop e2. Black decides to castle rather than recover the pawn right away. This is fine. That pawn is not going anywhere. White does the same. And now rook e8. So black has 3 pieces all pointed at that pawn. It's a goner. Here white played b3. Also a fine move, just getting ready to fianchetto the bishop to b2. Black took on e5. White played bishop b2. Knight takes f3 check. Bishop takes f3. And knight e5. So I think this is the first interesting position of the game. I think most people playing white would want to retain this light square bishop. I looked in the database, took a quick peek there, and white usually plays bishop e2 in this position. I think the computer was pining for knight c3, actually just letting black take on f3. But MrLegilimens decides to play bishop d5. And I think this move is questionable. I gave this move a dubious mark in my notes, because bishops generally don't do that well on central squares. A bishop's diagonal is not greatly affected one way or the other, whether it's on a centralized square or like a fianchetto square. So bishops don't do as well as knights when centralized. And here I think this bishop is just subject to attack. So EsolcNeveton actually played a5 here, but he could have instead played c6, which I think is a bit better of a move. Kicking the bishop, and then if white were to play bishop e4, he runs into this tactical idea. Knight takes c4, and black has a discovered attack on the bishop. So let's say after c6, white plays bishop f3 instead. Well, here, I think black can shoot their queen out to h4. And as can happen in the Budapest Gambit, black has some kingside activity brewing. And they could probably also take the bishop on f3, just knight takes f3 check. But I think queen h4 is maybe even more menacing. And I don't really see what white has gained by bringing the bishop to d5 and then just having to retreat it. Inducing c6 is nothing special. So I think that's what black should have done. Instead, EsolcNeveton plays a5. And as we go through these games, I'm probably going to occasionally ask you guys to pause your video and try to figure out an answer to one of my questions. And let's do that here. What do you think Black's idea is with a5? So why did EsolcNeveton play that? If you'd like to pause your video and figure that out, you can do so now. Okay, so the idea is a standard one for the Budapest Gambit, and that's to lift the black rook to the a6 square and try to swing it over to the king side, most likely to h6. If black can do that, then in conjunction with queen h4, white may have issues with their king. So this is a thematic rook lift idea that crops up a lot in the Budapest Gambit. Pretty much every player that studied the Budapest Gambit knows of this. I just think it was a little less good than that c6 move, but I do sympathize with how black played it. It's hard to resist this idea. So here, white played knight to d2, just developing. I actually thought queen h5 was pretty strong at this juncture, hitting the knight on e5, and by consequence, creating threats on f7 as well. And now, white is threatening bishop takes e5 for the moment. Black could just play d6 and try to defend the knight, but then white could chop off the knight, followed by taking on f7. So I think the move g6 is pretty logical. But if g6 is played, white has a nice shot here. So white to move? What do you think is white's strongest way of continuing? And if you'd like to pause your video and figure that out, you can do so now. All right, so white has the lovely shot, bishop takes f7 check. And no matter which way black takes this bishop, they suffer the consequences. So let's say knight takes f7, then white swoops in, queen takes c5, white's up a pawn, plus they have a very strong dark square bishop. Black will soon experience problems down this diagonal. If instead king takes f7, then white can grab the h7 pawn. And if, say, king f8, white can take on e5. And after rook takes e5, queen h8 check is a fork on the king and the rook. White wins too much material. Black's position is devastated. So my very first chess coach told me that the double attack is the key to chess, and that's always stuck with me. And I think here queen h5 would have been a nice way for white to take advantage of the temporary lack of harmony in black's camp. So instead, white played that knight d2 move, and here black continued with rook a6. Again, I think black has to be cautious about the queen h5 ideas. That's why I think maybe they should have played d6 instead, just stabilizing the knight on e5. I know that means the rook may not become active along the 6th rank, but in view of that idea I just showed, I think that was the smartest way of continuing. But after rook a6, white played knight e4, hitting the bishop. Black's bishop retreated to a7. And here, white tried the idea, but just a little bit too late. So white played queen h5, but I think this was a couple moves too late. And instead I analyzed this computer recommendation of f4. So attacking the knight in a bit different of a way. And this does give the pawn on e3 with check. But after king h1, knight g6, let's say, white can play knight g5. And once again, they have a lot of attacking ideas. You can see that black could have avoided a lot of misery by playing that c6 move earlier when the bishop came to d5. As it stands, this bishop has a chance to participate with white's other pieces and generate threats against black's king. And that's what you see indicated here. If white gets a chance to play the knight to g5, attacking f7, and he may even sneak in queen h5, hitting the h7 pawn. Another line I looked at after my recommended move here, f4, and then bishop takes e3, king h1. If black does not play knight g6, they might play rook h6 instead, which is kind of a clever way to threaten mate in 2, right? Like if white grabs on e5 now, then rook takes h2 check, king takes h2, queen h4 is sayonara. But instead, after rook h6, white can play a calm move, this move g3. So simply defending the h4 square. And then there's no risk of a rook sacrifice on h2, and this knight will have to retreat. And once it does retreat, I think white can get knight g5 in again, and white's in the driver's seat. I thought white had a nice initiative after this happens. So I'm going to try not to confuse you guys with too many side variations as we go through these games. As you can imagine, analyzing 8 games, there can be a lot of side variations. I'm going to, for the most part, try to stick to the main game, but I will point out tactical opportunities when they were there. And this is one of them. White could have played f4. Instead, white played queen h5. So, again, like right idea, but just wrong timing. Queen h5 would have been stronger when this rook was already not on the 6th rank. Because here, EsolcNeveton swung the rook over to h6, and even though white's double attacking e5, they can't take on e5 with the queen because they would just lose it. So here, MrLegilimens played queen to g5. I think queen f5 was actually almost forced in this position because you'll see the deficiency with queen g5. And in fact, if you'd like to figure out how black can exploit this move, feel free to pause your video and do so now. So black to move. Okay, so black came up with the great tactical shot, knight f3 check. So forking the king and the queen, compelling white to capture, and now rook g6. And all of a sudden, white is skewered down the g-file and must give up their queen, concede a little bit of material. Which white did. Queen takes g6, h takes g6. Now the game does continue. White does have a rook plus a minor piece for the queen. So bad position for white, but not yet fatal. White played the knight to g3. A sad necessity, I think, because white noticed that black is ready to play c6 and trap the bishop. So they try to give that bishop a bit of a retreat square. So knight to g3, pawn c6 hitting the bishop, bishop e4. Here black played bishop b8. I'm not sure this repositioning of the bishop was necessary. I can understand that black wasn't completely happy with the bishop on this current diagonal, but I think it was more to the point to play f5 and chase the light square bishop even further. And I like the engine suggestion of, after f5, bishop d3, playing king f7, looking to swing a couple pieces over to the h-file and hit that pawn down on h2. This could be a big bother to white. So black plays bishop b8, white plays rook a d1. Here black offered a trade of the bishops, which I think white should take him up on and just swap on e5 right now, maybe continue with f4 thereafter. But instead, white played bishop to a3, trying to avoid the swap. Black played f5. Here white tried to counterattack f4, and they traded. Rook takes e5. Now, I think if white is going to claw back in this game, they have to prevent the activation of this bishop. So you'll see coming up that I have a couple recommendations about how white could do that and how black could try to avoid getting that bishop shut in. So here white played bishop d6. That's a good start, stopping black from moving this d-pawn and also doing it with tempo on the rook. Rook e8. White played rook d4, hitting the pawn on e4, maybe getting ready to double up on the d-file. And here, I think black should care less about the e4 pawn and more about the future of this piece. This is kind of a subtle moment, because the move black played is understandable, but it looks like it was best for black to play b6, trying to get in bishop b7 and then maybe c5, and not really worry about the e4 pawn. I think, let's just say hypothetically, white takes here. Well, they probably just run into problems right away after c5, because if the rook moves, they're going to lose the knight. So black shouldn't pay much mind to the defense of the pawn and instead look to activate their pieces. But black played queen g5, pinning the knight. And here, I think was MrLegilimens' best chance to try to shut in that bishop by playing c5. If he goes c5, shutting down this b-pawn, then the position is kind of unclear. I mean, I tend to think black is still better here, but in a practical game, especially if you're getting relatively short on time, this may not be easy to play for black. So that was an excellent chance for white. But instead, white played king h1, kind of hiding their king, and then black had a chance to play c5, hitting the rook. Rook d5, queen f6 was played, eyeing the f3 square. And here, white maybe played a dubious move, rook fd1. Probably better to play the king back to the g-file, simply to overprotect this pawn. But honestly, I think the damage has been done now. Black could continue with b6 and get ready for bishop b7. Black should be on the path to winning. So after rook fd1, black played queen takes f2, just gobbling a pawn. Knight f1, defending e3. And queen takes a2, and here white threw in the towel and resigned. Perhaps a bit prematurely, but this is a losing position, provided black plays somewhat accurately. And actually, the bishop on c8 never even had to get in the game. Black's play was sufficient in white's eyes. So, scrolling back through this game, I think this is a good illustrative game for the Budapest Gambit in general. I actually showed this from white side. I probably should have shown it from black side. Let me actually flip it around just for a second while we scroll through it. You can kind of see the appeal of this gambit. Black gets to play some active moves at the outset of the game, and often they'll just regain that pawn on e5. But if I were offering a suggestion to white, and this is probably what I would include in my chessable repertoire, I believe bishop f4 here, trying to get the bishop outside the chain. Even if white does cede the pawn on e5, it is a little bit better to have the bishop there than on the long diagonal, I think. And a little bit later in this game, as played, you can see the importance of white exploiting their tactical opportunities before black really gets going with their kingside attack. I think white was just a little bit too late on the queen h5 idea, and they tried to implement this tactical shot, hitting e5 and f7 at the wrong moment, and black responded with the strong move rook h6, which led to a domino effect of black eventually winning the queen with that neat little knight f3 tactic. But if white had played queen h5 on move 12 before black's rook had hit the a6 square, so right here, this could have been big trouble. And the line that highlights that is g6, bishop takes f7 check, whereupon either capture is leading to a loss for black, loss of material. So good game, though, between two almost identically rated opponents, 17-14 versus 17-15. Okay, so I'm going to cross that one off our list. I'm just keeping this to remind myself which games I've gone through. And let's go to our next game. So the next one we're going to look at is Toddle versus Steiger07. So Toddle is 1960, Steiger07, 1987. So two pretty strong players battling it out here. And this was a Sicilian. Open Sicilian and a Najdorf variation, the Cadillac of chess openings. I think the Najdorf is popular at virtually every level, and the influence of Fischer and Kasparov is not fading one bit. You still see this, although not so much at the very elite level. Like in the candidates tournament, you haven't noticed too many players willing to risk the Najdorf as black, or really any open Sicilians. And I say risk because it does produce more unbalanced battles than the current move that seems to be popular at the highest level, which is e4, e5. Lots of Berlins, lots of Roy Lopez's in general. But there's nothing at all wrong with the Sicilian and the Najdorf in particular. I don't think the Najdorf will ever be refuted, and Najdorf games are always fun to analyze. So here, Toddle played bishop e3. This is the English attack, popularized by English players, where the plan for white is usually to play f3, queen d2, castle long, and then throw these kingside pawns at black, who, if white has their way, will be castled kingside and will be experiencing the full force of white's pawn storm. So black played b5 here. I think this move is a little dubious, and I think it's possible that Steiger07 has played against the English attack before, but maybe hasn't studied the theory in exactly the right way. So hopefully this video will kind of give them a clue as to what to do. If you look in the database, then you'll find that e5, e6, e6, or knight g4 are all more popular moves at this juncture for black. I actually kind of like knight g4. I think disturbing this bishop on e3 is an intriguing way of continuing. Kasparov, for instance, he's played all these moves for black. e6, e5, knight g4. They're probably all about equal in strength. But b5, on the other hand, I think is premature. Toddle responded with bishop d3 here, but in fact, I think the way to take advantage of b5 is a4. So hitting that pawn, black doesn't really want to take, because if they capture on a4, then this pawn on a6 will be isolated. So forging ahead with b4 makes a lot of sense. But after knight d5, I think black has to be pretty careful. They only have one piece developed, this knight on f6, compared to white's three pieces. The pawn on b4 has potential to be overextended. Taking e4 is really asking for it. I didn't exactly analyze this line, but let's just say hypothetically that's played. I think queen f3 is a appetizing move for white, hitting the knight, and if the knight moves, there may even be some discovered attack threats against that rook on a8. For instance, let's say knight here, maybe even knight f6, check. Just let black take it, but then go gobble this rook. So white is raising the stakes at a time when black is not well developed. So therein lies the problem, I think, with b5. Compared to like e5, for instance, which is also not a developing move, but black hits the knight in the center, they gain a tempo. Also e6 just solidifies some squares in the center, so it's a little safer. And knight g4 hits the bishop. So all three of those moves just accomplish more than b5. But instead of a4, Toddle played bishop to d3. Probably they were worried about the defense of the e4 pawn. So they're preparing for b4, let's say knight a4, and ensuring that black cannot respond with knight takes e4. But a little bit slow. So Steiger played bishop b7, white reinforced f3, e6, and now some standard moves, queen d2, knight bd7. If I were white here, I probably would have castled. I think this is the most flexible way of proceeding. If you're adopting this English attack formation, you're almost always castling long. And given that black hasn't revealed a lot about their setup yet, I would do that because I want to keep my g and my h pawns flexible. Toddle instead played h4 here, but this somewhat indicates white's intentions. And I think there's a lot to be said for leading with the g pawn instead of the h pawn first. So again, I would have castled and preserved both of those options. So h4, black played h5. This is one way of reacting as black. By playing h5, he stops the h-pawn in its tracks and also ensures that white's g-pawn can't come up to g4 without it being lost. So white castled. Black played queen c7. Here white played a useful move, I think, king b1, just getting the king off of the same file as black's queen. Knight c5. And now I really like the move that white played next. It's the computer's top suggestion as well, but it makes a lot of sense when you start thinking about it. So white played bishop g5, threatening the knight, potentially trying to destroy the structure if white's allowed to take on f6. I think the way that white could have followed up after this was pretty strong, but in a vacuum, I do like bishop g5. So black played bishop e7, normal move, developing, defending the knight. So here is where I think the game could have taken an interesting course had white played a certain move. And if you'd like to pause your video and figure out how white should proceed, you can do so now. Okay, so I feel like white is in a position to strike here. And even though the line that I'm about to demonstrate leads to an unclear position, I think it's a principled way of proceeding. You can make an argument that white should play something like rook he1, but a lot of times black is too solid in the center in the Najdorf for white to prepare like an e5 break, let's say. So even though rook he1 looks normal and you're including the rook, I'm not sure what the follow-up really is because we're not going to be going e5. So the move that I analyzed here was bishop takes b5 check, which crops up in a lot of Sicilians, particularly the Najdorf. So you sacrifice the bishop for 2 pawns, then you take with the d knight, and then we're hitting the queen on c7 and the pawn on d6. And after, say, queen b6, knight takes d6 check, I think black should preserve their dark square bishop and just play king f8. And we have a kind of a fun position where white has 3 pawns for the piece, so white's not down any material. Black's king has also been forced to move, so that's going to interfere with black's coordination. But I'm not quite sure how to assess this. I think this is a position you could legitimately play for either side. And I think this would have led to a pitched battle. And I don't know, I'd be curious to see who comes out on top here. So that's how I think white should proceed here. I also looked at bishop takes f6, trying to get rid of the bishop first before doing, the knight first before doing this bishop takes b5 idea. I think this is a little less strong though, because after this, and now queen c6, knight takes d6 check, king f8, the fact that black has an unopposed dark square bishop may create some problems for white. I just wasn't totally convinced about this position, and the computer seems to think that black is better as well. So white should be looking at that sacrifice on b5. And often an indicator of whether this sacrifice is good is how weak the d6 pawn will potentially be after the sacrifice occurs. Instead, though, Toddle played g4, so he charges ahead on the king side. Again, standard way of proceeding in the English attack, but here I think this is misplaced. And Steiger07 took on g4. White took back. But the problem here is that White has kind of abandoned the defense of their e4 pawn. And I believe Black is sufficiently developed here where they could go after this pawn. Now, I'm not suggesting that they take it right away, but with the move b4, so trying to drive away this knight from c3, Black would have had an easy task of winning this pawn, and I think obtaining just a great position. After b4, White doesn't have much better than just moving the knight away, probably to the e2 square. No other safe square, actually. And then after knight f takes e4, as far as I can see, White has just lost a pawn for insufficient compensation. And also their queen is under attack, and you've got this bishop lurking on b7 that may participate in a discovery on the rook. Like, say White plays queen e3, maybe just knight takes g5, and in fact, White could be losing a boatload of material here, right? If h takes g5, then this rook on h1 is double attacked. Let's say takes, or even just bishop takes. If really needed, Black could always bail out to the queen side with their king. They haven't touched their king yet, so castling that wing is available. And this is a disaster. So as played after this trade on g4, Black had a good opportunity with b4, and given that White has to save their knight and e4 is falling, I think Black is on the way to winning this game. Occasionally when b4 is played in a Najdorf, White has the option to jump into d5 as a sacrifice, but here I just don't think they really get any compensation. They don't have enough firepower coming down on Black's king to make this worthwhile. So instead, Steiger07 played knight takes g4, so grabbing this pawn, but that's a less useful pawn to take, and in fact this helps White in a way you'll see coming up. So here, White took on e7. I think taking on b5 is still interesting, by the way. White could have opted for this same idea, but he decides to take on e7. And here's where I think things start to go astray for Black. They've been doing a fine job of navigating the opening complexities up till this point, but here they needlessly weaken their position. So I believe Steiger07 should just play queen takes e7, retaining the right to castle, and maybe thought about castling queenside, as I described earlier. This knight is undefended and kind of floating out there, but I think it might find a stable square on e5. But instead, Black created problems for themselves by taking with the king, connecting the rooks, but this allows some queen g5 check ideas, and overall the king is just not going to be that comfortable in the center. So big mistake by Black with that move. White played rook hg1, hitting the knight. Black dropped the knight back to f6, and now Toddle grabbed on g7, and here Black committed a big mistake. It should be noted that Black's position is still technically okay. I think if they would have played rook a to g8 and just sought a trade of rooks and tried to simplify the game a little bit, they were still very much in this thing. But instead, Black took on h4. And here, White starts playing very well. White's play was beyond reproach for the rest of the game. I got to say that Toddle just executed Black quite efficiently from here. So he started with rook f1, attacking the knight on f6. And if the knight were to move, Black is going to run into either queen g5 or just a capture on f7. So you can see White is increasing the pressure on those two squares. Black played rook g4, looking to trade. I can't really criticize this move. There's just not that much better for Black. It's too little too late. So rook g4, and White simply traded and then played queen g5 check, forking the king and the knight. Knight back to f6 won't do any good, so Black played f6. White gave a check here first, and then just gobbled the knight. And White is up a clean piece at this stage, and Black's king is still exposed. Black played queen f7. Here White played b4, just hitting the knight. Black took on d3. I kind of dislike what Toddle did next. I know I said his play was beyond reproach. The computer thinks it's fine what he did. I would have just taken back on d3, I think. But he actually played knight takes e6 first. If you play this, you just have to figure out what you're going to do after king to e7, because now you'd like to win the knight on d3, but Black will play queen takes e6. But Toddle showed that he had this all worked out. He played knight d5 check, bishop takes d5, and e takes d5. And I was a little bit amazed when I saw this position, because I was thinking, like, well, can't just black play knight e5 here and save the knight? But after queen d4, black is remarkably helpless to stop queen into b6. And their king is just, in a word, too exposed. If rook b8, then queen a7 is a big problem. And I think it's just going to be the end of the line for black. I suppose knight c4 could be played. I didn't look at this move too closely, but I bet that something like maybe knight g5, and this pawn is pinned, and there's two pieces already attacking f6, maybe rook e1 check to come. This should be very good for white. But just the fact that this is even playable, that's kind of why I question the decision to go knight takes e6 in the first place. I think white had a real straightforward option, just making the recapture, and they'll still be up a piece. Because when you're ahead, you want to try to create as few headaches for yourself as possible and just win based on your extra material. And this is something that to a human I think looks slightly unclear. And black should probably try knight e5 for the record. Steiger played something similar, rook g8 hitting the queen. But then after queen d4, knight e5 saving the piece, queen a7 check came in, and this is now forced mate. Black has to play king e8. I think if they play knight to d7, maybe it's not quite forced mate, but rook e1 lining up against the king, which is helpless to escape since it can't go to d8 or f8. This will soon be game over. White's threatening all sorts of devastating discoveries with the knight. So queen a7 check, king e8. Here Toddle played queen b8 check, king here, check again, just inching closer. Now if king e8, then queen to d8 is checkmate. So black was forced to block with the knight, and you guessed it, rook e1. And black resigned because of all the possible discoveries that are coming. So a 32-move victory for white. Entertaining Sicilian Najdorf game in the English attack. Just to summarize this one very quickly, I think b5 is dubious for black. I wouldn't repeat that. I would choose one of those three moves that I recommended, e6, e5, or knight g4. A bit later, there was that intrigue surrounding the possibility of bishop takes b5. This is a theme that you want to be aware of for both white and black if you routinely get in these structures. Instead, white played g4, and black had a great opportunity to play, at this moment, that strong move b4, which would have led to the capture on e4 and I think the complete collapse of white's position. But instead, the momentum swung white's way after black took on g4, and it was all Toddle from this moment forward. Never thought I'd actually say that. It was all Toddle. Whatever that means. And the only thing I can criticize is the decision to play knight takes e6, but again, it's not a real criticism because the engine just says it's straight winning. I just think it's more complicated than white needs to make it be. So good game in that one, guys. Let's cross that one off the list. And we are rolling right along. I was trying to figure out how much time I would apportion to each game. I think Kevin and I discussed something like an hour and 20 minutes maybe of recording time, but I have a feeling I'm going to go longer than that just to give these games their proper due. So this is the next one. This is Atrophied playing white versus cyanfish as black, 2 players above 2,000. And we're going to look at this from black's point of view, since cyanfish was the victor in this game. And this was a French defense. Atrophied played knight c3 on move 3. I also like this move. I also play knight d2. Really, white has a lot of options against the French. I mean, both of those knight moves, e5, the advanced variation, even taking on d5, the exchange is often played. But knight c3, black played knight f6, and now bishop g5. Here, I most often see, or at least I saw when I used to play this from the white side, most of my opponents would go bishop e7, breaking the pin, or bishop b4, the so-called McCutcheon variation, pinning white's knight. But cyanfish plays d takes e4, which is perfectly legitimate. This is the burn variation, where you capture on e4. And now bishop e7, breaking the pin. Atrophied takes on f6. And here, cyanfish decides to go for this very unbalanced Morozevich line. So named after, of course, Alexander Morozevich, the former Russian super grandmaster. Still quite high rated, but not quite part of the elite these days. So g takes f6 clearly unbalances the game. Black is voluntarily accepting doubled pawns, but they retain their bishop pair. They're not so much hoping to use the g file, but the possibility of a strike with f6, f5 is what appeals to black in this line. And I know I've seen some recent games, including one in the US Chess League, which was won by Elliot Liu playing the white pieces, where white has handled this line pretty well. But we'll see in this game that if you like a fight, this line is not a bad one to choose for black. So Atrophied played knight f3, f5, knight c3, a6. This is a useful move preparing b5. Queen e2. This move looks odd, but in fact it's one of the best for white, preparing to castle queenside. Yes, white blocks the bishop, but one argument against developing the bishop right now is that the bishop doesn't really have a great square. I mean, if it goes to d3, it's kind of blocked by the pawn on f5. And if it goes to c4, it's just staring into two connected pawns on f7 and e6. So instead of opting for a banal development of the bishop, white is setting their sights on bigger things like castling queenside and then trying to force through this d5 advance. Because white does have a lead in development, so they may want to exploit it. So here, black played b5, castles, and b4 hitting the knight. This is all theory. Knight a4. And here, black played a move straight after my own heart, actually. As you guys know, I love the Scandinavian. And black played a Scandi-like move, queen to d5, hitting the pawn on a2. So white played c4. Atrophied plays the book move in reply, attacking the queen. And here is where the game gets into new territory. In fact, I think Cyanfish's next move is a novelty. The normal move is queen to a5. And there was a game, Aronian versus Vidit, from last year, 2015, where Aronian as white played queen e5 here, and they actually swapped queens, and black played bishop d7, hitting the knight. There's a trade. White might be a tiny bit better here, although the game was eventually drawn. So I think queen a5 is the best move, just because it immediately attacks that knight. If white were to play b3 here, by the way, then black could respond with bishop d7, hitting the knight, and if the knight were to go back to b2, they would lose the pawn on a2. So I didn't look too far into this when I was analyzing it, but it does seem like queen a5 is the best move. So instead, Cyanfish played b takes c3, taking en passant. It looks innocent, but after knight takes c3, queen a5, black has lost a little bit of time. Queen a5 is no longer coming with tempo because it doesn't hit the knight. And Atrophied put this to good use with his next move. And I haven't asked you guys for a quiz question in a hot minute, so let's do that now. So white to move. What do you think white should do? You can pause your video if you like. All right, so Atrophied played the principled move, which I like very much, d5. If white is going to exploit their trumps here, then they're probably going to try to use their development advantage and the fact that black's king is still in the center. And d5 fits in perfectly with those. White has the rook on d1 already, backing up this pawn. Knight on c3 also backing it up. And he's creating some tension between the pawns on d5 and e6. So black decided to get their king out of dodge. And here I think knight d4 was a pretty good move. This is also the engine suggestion. Threatening knight takes f5. Note that this bishop on e7 is undefended. But Atrophied, he played a move kind of in the same vein as his last move. Potentially a good one as well. It puts a lot of pressure on black. He played g4. So giving the black king no rest. Saying, if you take this pawn, I'm going to stick my rook on g1 and I'm going to have this rook barreling down on your monarch. So black responded with bishop b4. Notice that black hasn't even touched their queenside pieces yet. But he's trying to create some counterplay by threatening the knight on c3. And here, I think Atrophied made a mistake. Naturally, he wants to defend that knight. It doesn't have a really good square to flee to. And g takes f5 would be a bit too ambitious after bishop takes c3. So we want to defend this knight, but I think we should defend it with a rook. And the engine also like this, playing rook d3. And the rook may prove useful on the third rank. Like I could envision this white knight moving and these two pawns getting traded and maybe the rook swinging over to g3 with check. But most importantly, after take and take, you don't trade the queens off. Yes, white might have to give up this pawn, but I'm not even sure black really has time to properly take that pawn because the only thing black has attacking is their queen, and Meanwhile, they're about to get killed with rook g1, king over, queen e5, stuff like that. So rook d3 was the move that white should have played here. Instead, he played queen e3, reinforcing c3 with the queen. But then after bishop takes c3, white took with the pawn. He probably should have taken with the queens, but I can understand Atrophied's hesitation to do that because trading off the queens when you've already revealed your attacking intentions seems like a step backwards. But b takes c3, in fact, led to some problems after black's strong reply. So I'll ask you guys to try to find this one as well. Black to move, very messy position. See if you can find a good move for black that kind of combines attack and defense. That's the hint I'll give you. So a move that combines attack and defense for black. You can pause your video if you like. So the move that would have got the job done here, or actually did get the job done because cyanfish played this move, is f4. A deflection move. So black is trying to get white to take this pawn so they can take on c3 with check and totally expose white's king. And also one that helps to keep lines closed on the king side. So white will have a harder time getting at black's king. Great move. I love moves that are multi-purpose like that. So after f4, Atrophied played queen d4, still keeping an eye on the c3 pawn. And here, starting from this point, the game just gets really unclear. It already has been kind of unclear, but now it starts to get really messy. So black played queen a3 check. I think actually c5 was interesting, trying to hit the queen with tempo. One idea being that if white takes en passant, then black gets to develop a piece with tempo. But black played queen a3 check, and white responded with king to d2. And here black took on a2 with check. So it seems hard to criticize giving a couple checks and simultaneously driving your opponent's king out. But one piece of advice I have is if you're attacking your opponent's king and your opponent knows that their king is exposed and subject to assault, sometimes one of the most uncomfortable things you can do to them is to just make them keep their king in the danger zone. In other words, play something that does not force their king out of the line of fire. And with queen a3 followed by queen takes a2, yes, black bags a pawn, but in a way they kind of help white because white gets to run over to the potential safe haven on the king side. They just get much closer to that goal. So I know it's hard to resist doing that, but I think that is a big argument in favor of a move like c5. So instead, as played, white ran with their king. Here black played e takes d5. And white smartly decided to continue developing. It's kind of hard for white to outright attack the king now because this g file has been closed. If Atrophied could give up this pawn on g4, I'm sure he would do that, so he could play rook g1 check. Atrophied is like 2,800 in Crazy House, by the way. So you know that if there's any chance to get at his opponent's king, even in a regular chess game as opposed to a Crazy House game, he's probably going to spot it because he's very good at coming up with attacking solutions. So he sensed that he just needed to develop here. So he played bishop d3, which also gives the king access to f1. Now here again, this is a tough moment for black. Cyanfish played rook e8 check. Seems good, but the computer really hates this move. It actually suggests queen to b3, which would be a difficult move to find. But the idea is to take that rook in the crosshairs and thereby prevent king f1 by threatening queen takes d1 if white were to do that. So tough move, but I think this criticism that I made of queen a3 followed by queen takes a2 can also translate to rook e8. You're kind of just pushing the white king in the direction it wants to flee anyways. It looks like you're winning time, but I'm not sure it's the best approach. So here black continued developing, knight d7. It must be said, though, this position is incredibly messy, and even in a longer game like 45 plus 45, I mean, I would be scared if I were white or black here. There's a lot to calculate, period. So knight g5, also pretty tempting, bringing another piece in to attack h7. I think the engine actually preferred king g2, just connecting the rooks and completing the king's journey over to the king side. But knight g5 worked out well for Atrophied because black responded with knight e5. Here, black had a very unusual defensive resource. And this is pretty tough. I would say if you're more of a beginning player, you probably are not going to find the move that is best here. But if you want to give it a shot anyways, regardless of your level, feel free to pause your video and figure out what black should play right here. So black to move. What is black's best try? All right, so this move is pretty nice. It's the move f3. Pawn f3. Seemingly making a useless pawn advance when your king is about to get squashed. But the idea of this move is to not only stop king g2, but also to use the e2 square in some cases. And one line that illustrates this is if bishop takes h7 check, king f8, let's say white goes for the throat, queen h8 check. I think white should actually drop the bishop back, but let's just say white goes queen h8 check, driving the king out. Now, rook e1 looks completely crushing, right? Because if the king were to move, let's say king here, white can just pick up this rook and white's up too much material. But if you saw that black has queen e2 check in response to rook e1 check, then give yourself a huge pat on the back, because that's the purpose of f3, allowing black to make this interposition exactly at this moment. And this entirely turns the tables, because after rook takes e2 check, pawn takes e2, king takes e2, rook takes h8. And after the dust has settled here, we have a position where black's just up a rook. He's got two rooks. White has one with two minor pieces each. So that entire line is initiated right here if black were to play f3. Obviously a very complicated line, and white is not forced to go into that by any means. But if white were to play queen h8 and rook e1, they'd be in for a rude awakening after queen e2. I just had to point this line out because it was so cool. Obviously, I had some help from the engine in finding that. Again, this position is so messy that even a very good player would have trouble handling the complications for both white and black. But f3 was a necessity here for black. Instead, cyanfish played knight e5. So trying to block white's activity down this diagonal, opening up their light square bishop. Atrophied responded with a good move. So he does not take the pawn on h7. He actually just plays rook e1, attacking the knight on e5. And this knight is pinned. If black were to take on d3, they would just get mated after rook takes e8. So black had little choice but to play f6 and defend the knight. And now knight takes h7, rather than bishop takes h7. Knight takes h7, threatening the f6 pawn. And here, cyanfish responded with bishop takes g4, knight takes f6 check, king f7, and here is where a tragedy occurs. If you've been paying attention, you can actually see the result right over here to the right on the little mini score sheet type thing, the game info. You can see that black actually wins this, and how could that be when Atrophied has seemingly turned the tables and white looks to be cruising to victory? Well, Atrophied just blundered here, unfortunately. Happens to all of us. White should play just knight takes g4. If they take that bishop, then the game could go knight takes g4, queen takes f4 check. Let's say black saves the knight, knight f6 check. Here there's a number of good moves for white, but there's even a forced continuation, bishop to g6. Excellent move, skewering the king and the rook. And if black takes the bishop, then I analyzed rook g1, king f7, queen takes c7, and black's going to get mated in a couple. I think knight d7 is the only way to stave off mate for a couple moves, but the main point is if king f8, queen g7 is checkmate. So that was the clinical way to get the job done, just knight takes g4, and black's king is far too exposed. But yeah, Atrophy took the rook, and if you want to figure out the problem with this move, you can do so now. So black to move, pause your recording, and figure out how cyanfish completely turned the tables at this moment. So cyanfish played bishop h3 check, which is in fact mate on the next move. White can't go to the e2 flight square because black's queen is covering that. So he has to play king g1, and then the knight comes in, knight f3 checkmate. And black has just enough in the tank to get the job done. Nice little mating pattern involving the bishop and the knight. So a tragedy as far as white is concerned, seizing a loss from the jaws of victory. The opposite of that saying, that famous saying, seizing defeat from the jaws of victory. Yeah, knight takes g4 would have just won the game. Knight takes e8 on the other hand led to this checkmate. But I think both players can be pretty satisfied with this one. It was a back and forth battle in a very interesting line. I think this line always produces complex, unbalanced fights. If I were giving advice to black, I would say you should play queen a5 here per the book line. Cyanfish might have even seen that when they reviewed this game. B takes c3, probably not a great novelty. I think white has tons of attacking chances after d5. And I think one thing of note for everyone is what I was saying about intentionally playing in a way that does not force your opponent's king out of the danger zone. If you're attacking your opponent's king, like making a concerted effort to think of ways to further your initiative beyond just checking their king out of the zone of danger that they're in. Because we kind of saw that white's king was trickling away with all these moves. Queen a3, queen takes a2, rook e8. It looks like black is making progress, but it's probably not the best way to go. I think black had to get the queenside pieces involved. All right, so let's cross that one off the list. Very entertaining game. And our next game is Matus 2 versus Sonata 2. The battle of the number twos. And I don't mean that in a dirty way. Okay, I'm going to look at this from black's point of view. So this one featured the most unusual opening of the 8 games. So Matus 2 played the Grab g4, which I have actually been a victim of recently. Yes, I've lost a game to this. Probably more than one game, in fact, in the past month or two. So the Grab, also known as the spike. Black can respond to this opening in almost any logical way. I usually play d5, so just occupying the center. E5, also completely fine, of course. Any logical move is fine here. Sonata 2 decided to play g6, and both sides fianchettoed their bishop. White played d4. And Sonata 2 attacked white's center with c5, so hitting that pawn. White advanced d5. Black played d6, so black is adopting kind of a Benoni-type setup, the way they're arranging these pawns. And here, notice after d6 that black has opened the avenue for the bishop to hit the pawn on g4. Therefore, I think white should play e4 to make sure that the queen is defending that pawn. Instead, white played c4, and this just allows bishop takes g4, after which white is operating at a pawn deficit. Sometimes in the Grab you can do this, but often that depends on your bishop's ability to create problems from g2, specifically on the b7 pawn. Like you'd imagine if this pawn were not on d5, white would play bishop takes b7. But with this bishop experiencing some scope problems being blocked in by this pawn, white just doesn't have that luxury. So white played h3, black dropped back here to d7, knight c3, knight f6. Both sides just developed over the course of the next few moves. Bishop g5. I like the move that black played next. He played queen a5. And this not only develops the queen, but it also introduces a attacking idea. White played rook c1 in reply. And I'll ask you guys, so black to move, what do you think would be a good way to follow up on black's previous move, queen a5? So if you want to pause your video and figure out how black should proceed, you can do so now. So those of you who play setups involving a fianchetto of the dark square bishop as black, I think will like this move, knight e4. Opening up 3 attackers on that knight on c3. So knight, queen, and now dark square bishop as well. And also hitting g5. Now I was surprised that black didn't play this. Maybe they just weren't thinking about it, or maybe they were trying to do it at a later date. But Sonata 2 instead played queen b4, hitting the pawn on b2. And white didn't even react to that. They just played queen d3. I think their idea here is that if queen takes b2, they're going to continue with just rook b1 and hit the queen and gain an attack against b7. Sonata 2 didn't take the pawn. He actually played bishop f5. Here he probably realized that if white played e4, I think both sides realized this, that black could actually respond with knight or bishop takes. Again, this knight is pinned. So white, after bishop f5, played queen e3. Black is still up a pawn, mind you. And he gained even another pawn by taking on c4. White took on e7, trying to get something back. And here, I think black should have continued developing. I had in my notes knight bd7. And if queen takes d6, then knight e4 all the same, trying to open lines, which produces kind of a complicated fight after knight takes e4, queen takes e4. Note that after knight takes e4, black cannot take the rook on c1 because it is defended by that bishop on g5. So black would have to do this, but if I were a betting man, I'd probably place my chances on black here because if white castles, then queen takes e2 could be played, picking up a valuable pawn. And this bishop on f5 does hold the knight on d7. So I think on move 13, after white took the pawn, black should have just continued developing with this. But instead, black took on d5. And here, white had a good chance to play knight takes d5 in reply. Queen takes d5. And now knight h4 with a discovery on the queen, with the main point being that if black moves the queen, like let's say queen e6, then white can take on b7 next. And that rook is a goner in the corner. So right here, after knight takes d5, white could have turned the tables. Knight takes d5, queen takes d5, knight h4, and white is better. They're going to win material. Instead, though, white hit the queen with a backwards move, knight to d2. But the problem is they haven't eliminated black's knight, which is attacking white's queen. So black could play knight takes e7 here. After knight takes c4, that would be kind of a trade. Instead, Sonata 2 decided to make this a little more complicated and played bishop takes c3. Again, both queens are hanging. White played queen takes d6 just to add to some of the confusion here. Then bishop takes d2 check. Bishop takes d2, still holding the rook. Black has multiple pieces hanging now, queen and also the knight on d5, but they are up a piece at the moment. So Sonata 2 grabbed the pawn on a2, queen takes d5, and here some order was restored to the position because the players traded the queens. And after the complications of the first 18 moves or so, we had a position where black is up a bit of material. They are going to lose the pawn on c5 next. You notice that bishop takes b7 as a threat, so they're going to give that pawn. So black will be up a little bit of material, one pawn, and the position is kind of stabilized. I think on the previous move, knight d7 might have been a bit stronger, trying to hold the c5 pawn. This would give the pawn on b7, but if white takes it, then rook b8 hits the bishop, and black can look forward to taking the pawn on b2 thereafter. But as played, knight c6, rook takes c5. Here black played rook c8, just defending the knight on c6. Since black is up a pawn, we should probably defer to his position a little bit. Black has slightly the better chances. But as you might have seen in a game that I played the other day, a standard game on Lichess, when you're facing an opponent who has the two bishops and you just have a bishop and knight, or even like two knights, that bishop pair is going to provide them some compensation if they're down a pawn or something. And that is making up some of white's play here. Here white played bishop c3. I think it's possibly best for white just to trade on c6 and try to take the game into an opposite color bishop ending. This is one thing that the defensive side can often threaten, just trying to translate the game into a drawish position with opposite color bishops. But white decides they're going to keep more tension in the position for now. So he plays bishop c3. And now rook fd8. White plays f3. Rook d6. And white's idea with f3 was to push e4. So they're preparing this advance. Here black pinned that pawn on e4 with rook e8. King f2. White is not worried about having their king in the center because with the queens off the board, neither side is really concerned about getting checkmated. So white might even figure that the king being closer to the center is an asset in the coming semi-endgame, queenless middle game, whatever you want to call it. Here black dropped the bishop back, bishop d7. And now here, I thought it was pretty tempting for white to play e5, which at first blush just looks like it wins the rook on d6. Maybe black has to sacrifice the rook on d5. But if you want to pause your video and try to figure out how can black avoid losing material here. So black to move, what's their best way of responding to e5? Okay, so if e5 is played, then black can respond with b6, counterattacking. There's a lot of attacking and counterattacking going on in this game. That's kind of a more of an advanced chess concept, I would say. If you're a beginning player out there watching this video, just know that you don't want to rely on counterattacks too often because you just don't have the skill set yet to do that properly. But had this position occurred, I'm pretty confident that Sonata would have found this move. And white's rook is now under attack. If e takes d6, black can respond with b takes c5, restoring the material balance. And I think if rook c4, then they're going to lose the bishop on d5 for one thing. If rook b5, I think black could even consider playing in the same vein with a6. Possibly even a discovered attack would work, like knight takes e5. I'm not sure. Yeah, actually, knight takes e5 would work, wouldn't it? Yeah, that should be fine as well. So if e5 is played, then I think this is the best way of continuing. If you said knight takes e5 here instead of b6, then the issue with your line is that after bishop takes e5, rook takes e5, you run into bishop takes f7 check. And black captures, white captures on e5, and black is down the exchange. They do have one pawn for it, and the position remains potentially defensible for black, but white is playing for the win here. So kind of a digression from what occurred in the game. As played, instead of e5, white played f4 here, still plowing ahead with their center pawns. White's creating a lot of problems for black with these center pawns backed up by the bishops. Here black played b6, attacking the rook, and true to the nature of this game, white responds with a counterattack, bishop e5, to which black responded with this capture, f takes. And here again, if rook takes e5, you already saw the issue with that. White can respond with bishop takes f7 and then win the rook. So Sonata 2 played b takes c5, and now e takes d6. So often when there's a bunch of exchanges that just occur, it makes sense to take a deep breath, take a step back from the position, and try to assess what's going on. Here we can see that white remains down a pawn. White has 4 pawns against black's 5, but white is pinning their hopes on their central mass. In particular, this d6 pawn. It's a little difficult for black to neutralize. There's not an easy way for black to do that at present. Also, white's rook is ready to join the action. I'm sure white was licking their chops, thinking about ways they can get that rook involved, maybe via c1 or a1. So here, black played rook b8. I do think black has better chances, though, at this stage. Or it might be equal, but I think the onus is still on white to prove that since they are down the pawn. Here, white played king f3. Probably the best move here was king to g3. Sneakier than king f3, because if king g3 and black grabs this pawn on b2, white does have this counterattack, rook f1, opening up 2 attackers on the f7 pawn. So I think that was preferable here. King f3, on the other hand, doesn't help white too much in my eyes. After rook takes b2, though, white didn't give up any hope. They are down 2 pawns, but after rook a1, they're on the counterattack, hitting that pawn on a7. Black backs the rook up here, hits the pawn on d6. Now, black would love it if white took here. They'd be very happy to exchange their lame a pawn for that valuable and potentially annoying d pawn that already is annoying. So white correctly played e5, supporting that pawn. Here black played a6. And black is just up 2 pawns right now. 5 pawns versus 3 pawns. But white's play in the center makes it unclear. White played rook a5, attacking that pawn. Black blocked it, bishop b5. Now white brought up their king. Black played king g7, getting out of the way of this f-pawn being pinned. Here white played h4. And here, I think if I were black, I would have started trying to chip away at white's center with the move f6, looking to destroy the e5 pawn. You may not even take it straight away after f6 is played, but I think you want to get this move in, because if white plays e6, then black is going to chop on d6. Here I analyzed e7, rook takes d5, rook takes b5, and black at the very end has just king f7, stopping the promotion of the pawn, and black should just win the rook ending. They are up several pawns now. So I think that's what I would have done here after h4, is just immediately play f6. Black played h6, and then after rook a2, then played f6. But white didn't give up. I really admire white's persistence in this game. They played very tenaciously. They played rook c2. And that's why I think f6 should have been played a couple moves ago. White's rook on a5 was not very well placed. And after h6, they just get this one tempo to reposition it. And now when f6 comes, all of a sudden rook c2 and white's on that pawn on c5. the position is not clear. Here, black played g5 check. H takes g5, h takes g5, king e4. White wants to stay nearby the e-pawn, clearly. And now, it seems like black's next move is kind of panicky. At least that's the way it seemed to me when it was played. It doesn't lose the game or anything. In fact, I think with best play, it should be a draw. I think just trading on e5 and then playing a move like rook b8, preparing a potential check on e8 would have been fine for black. The engine was saying that white could play bishop e6 here and try to block the e-file, and maybe black still has to be accurate because of the d-pawn, but it's hard to believe that white could ever win this. Black could always give up the bishop for the pawn, and white would have no pawns left, which is kind of what occurred in the game. So I think f takes e5 was just a calmer option here. Instead, Sonata 2 played bishop d3 check, giving up the bishop, but his contention is that after king takes d3, f takes e5, white will not be able to save this pawn. And as played in the game, d7, rook to d6, attacking the bishop and the pawn, king e4, and now rook takes d7. So black has successfully eliminated that final pawn. White took on e5. Now, white can still play this for a win, because even though black has 3 pawns for the piece, they're all disconnected, they're not going anywhere, and white can start slowly rounding them up. But even if black were to lose all those pawns, we would get down to king and rook and bishop against king and rook. And that is a theoretical draw. It's a very well-known type of ending, king, rook, and bishop versus king and rook. It is a theoretical draw. I must say, though, that lots of players have lost that ending with the king and the rook. And it's, in fact, a useful one to study if you're a bit higher rated, because it can be played for a win, and you can create a lot of problems if you're the side with the rook and the bishop. So it's one of these endings that is drawn in theory, but in practice it's difficult to prove. So hence the game continued. Black played rook c7, white played king d6, and white's task now is just to round up the pawns without allowing a rook exchange. If the rooks get traded, it's going to be an instant draw. So here white played bishop c6, because they can't play rook takes c5 right away without allowing the trade. So they block the c-file and then pick up the pawn next. Black played g4, g3, white grabs another pawn. Now here, if you'd like to pause your video and figure out how black can best hold this position, you can feel free to do so, because I mentioned that even if black loses the g-pawn, they can still hold. But right at this juncture, there was a straightforward way to draw the game for black and just wrap things up right here. So if you want to pause your video and find that, you can do so now. Okay, so black could have sacrificed their rook for the bishop with rook takes c6 check. And when I saw that the engine was recommending this, it took me a bit aback for a moment, because I thought, wait, isn't black's king like a long ways away from their pawn? But it's pretty simple once you just look at the 2 lines that are possible. So let's say rook takes c6 is played. Well, black's going to advance their king to go up and assist the pawn. White's got to rush their king back in an effort to try to coordinate and stop that pawn. But after g2, threatening to queen, rook goes here, king f4, king d4, king f3. You can see that white's king is prevented from coming back towards the g1 square by black's king. We would say that white's king is shouldered out. That's a common theme in endings. And shouldering refers to a situation like this where one king prevents the opponent from reaching certain squares with their king, almost shoving them out of the way. So black is making progress like up the board to assist their pawn and stopping white's king from reaching vital squares like e3 and e4 in the process. So that's what could have happened. Rook takes c6 check. And if rook takes c6, black just moves their king up to assist. If king takes c6, I think a little less logical, because white's king is drawn even further away from the g-pawn. It's pretty similar. King f5, and even this is a shouldering move, king e4, stopping white's king from reaching d5. And black is just close enough to help their pawn. They're going to advance their pawn and promote it, and white will have to give up their rook, and we'll be down to king versus king. So instead of rook takes c6, though, we must bear in mind that these games are 45 plus 45. Even though there's an increment, I'm sure that both players were in time pressure or experiencing some time duress at this stage. So Sonata 2 played rook g8, getting behind the pawn. White blockaded the pawn with bishop to g2, king g5, and now rook a4, cutting off the black king. And here, the game just abruptly ends. I was actually going to email Kevin and ask him what happened here. I suspect that black lost on time because, black wouldn't just resign this position. There's no reason to think they would do that. So I bet Sonata 2 flagged at this point, but I don't know, because with the increment, it's kind of hard to flag when you have 45 seconds minimum per move. And Sonata 2 plays a lot of bullet. So if you're out there, Sonata 2, and you're watching this, or Matus 2 as well, the guy playing white, feel free to let us know what actually happened. So kind of an abrupt conclusion. White wins here. And the position totally drawn still. So this was kind of a weird game. There was the opening was weird. That probably set the tone for this entire encounter. I think it was an interesting game. But just the type of struggle that was produced, it was kind of an odd one. There were a lot of attacks and counterattacks, as you saw. Like even this little exchange right here. White's queen is attacked on e7 by the knight on d5, and white just plays knight d2. I was illustrating that knight takes d5, queen takes d5, knight h4 would have been stronger. And after the complications, we got into this ending where white, much to his credit, was persistent in playing for a win despite being down a pawn. And at various times, white could have just taken on c6 and gone into an opposite color bishop ending, but he resisted that temptation and managed to create this pawn on d6 that ended up giving black some issues. But I think the proper result of this game should have been a draw, as evidenced by the analysis at the end. Okay, so that is our fourth game. We crossed that off the list. We're halfway through. Let's go to the next one. Steiger 07 making another appearance against Knoddel this time. We're going to look at this one from white's point of view. We have another Sicilian in this game. So white plays e4, c5, but instead of an open Sicilian, we get the so-called Smith-Morra gambit. So d4 takes, and now c3. This characterizes the Smith-Morra gambit, whereby white is giving up a pawn to speed up their development. There are ways that black can decline this gambit, of course. I'm kind of a fan of knight f6 or d3 here. Those are the two best ways to decline the pawn if you don't want to. Because I feel like a lot of people who play this opening, they look forward to playing down the pawn because they know that they get an initiative as a result. So declining it can be psychologically a good decision, just not playing ball with white and proceeding normally. So knight takes c3. Knoddel played knight to c6, knight f3. Now here, black universally plays pawn to d6. And then after bishop c4, e6, there's quite a bit of theory. But instead, black played knight f6. You just got to be careful about playing this move too quickly in the Smith-Morra because you often get hit with the move e5. I do, in fact, think white could play that move right now. Like if e5, knight g4, some unclear complications are produced after, like, say, bishop f4. White does have to defend the pawn on e5, but then again, black's knight is kind of floating out on g4. But instead, Steiger 07 just plays bishop c4. Black plays e6. Now here, I think if I were white, I would have played queen e2, reinforcing the pawn on e4. Black castled, and I think this gives black a good practical way of proceeding. Black is a bit behind in development, so I kind of hesitate to suggest what I'm going to suggest here. But if you want to figure out a way that black can try to simplify the game a little bit, pause your video and do so now. So black to move, what's a straightforward way that black can play? All right, so here I think black could have gone for the center fork trick with knight takes e4, and then d5. And because of the fork on the bishop and the knight, they're guaranteed to win their piece back. And black has two center pawns to white's none, which I think will make it difficult for white to attack black. I don't think white's hugely worse here, but I think they will be a pawn down when all is said and done. So I would have strongly considered that if I were black. Instead, Knoddel played bishop e7. And here, Steiger played queen e2 at this juncture. They could have played e5 once again. This might even be better, chasing the knight and then playing bishop f4 and trying to exploit this knight out here on g4. So queen e2, black played d6. And now white played a normal move for the Smith-Morra. It's often the logical continuation after queen to e2, White played rook d1, lining up with black's queen on d8 and introducing the possibility of e5. Now, I think black's best bet in responding to this, you can kind of do it in two ways. Oftentimes just fleeing with the queen, like queen to c7, is a decent move. Although I think with white's knight being within striking distance of the queen on c7, I would hesitate to do that. I think the best way of playing for black is to lose a tempo and play e5, and also open the light square bishop, but it's probably worth it just to stabilize the center. Instead, though, Knoddle played knight g4, and they're trying to prevent e5 by sending another piece to dispute that square. But white continued with bishop f4. Here, I know the engine preferred playing h3, and then after knight g to e5, trading the knights and continuing with bishop f4 now, when bishop takes e5 is a threat. And I gotta say, I agree with the engine, because after knight takes c4, queen takes c4, even though black has simplified the position a little bit, upon castles, white has this tactical operation, bishop takes d6. Idea being bishop takes d6, knight b5, and this bishop is pinned because of the queen on d8. So white is going to be regaining their material, probably with an advantage too, because white is better developed. Black hasn't got their bishop yet in the game. I could foresee black having problems with white quickly infiltrating down the d-file when they recapture. So maybe h3 was the strongest way of proceeding. Steiger07 played bishop f4, which I think is a pretty hard move to criticize because it does attack d6 and it also adds another attacker to the e5 square. But it does give black a chance to play the e5 move again, which I think black has to play here. I think they just have to bite the bullet and admit that they're going to lose the tempo with the pawn, and also admit that their knight is not going to go to the e5 square. I think that was their best shot. Instead, Knoddle played castles, but this ran into h3, and now I think it dawned on black that they have tactical issues here, because knight e5 is just not possible. If knight e5 is played, then knight takes, bishop takes, and at the end of the day, this pawn is pinned because the queen is lost on d8 if this series of exchanges is to occur. So after h3, black had to resort to e5 now, but the timing is just poor on this. Black is relying on a counterattack, and as we talked about in the last game, you have to be very certain of what's going to happen if you do that. And here the tactics favor white. White calmly played bishop g3, saving their knight, and black is forced to retreat their knight. He went to h6, and now white takes on e5, regaining the pawn because of that pressure down the d-file. Here black tried to develop bishop e6. The players traded bishops on this square. And here I think white had a strong continuation that would have accentuated their advantage, and in fact even won a little bit of material. So if you want to figure out how white should proceed from here, pause your video and do so now. All right, so more tactics down the d-file possible. White could have played knight takes c6, b takes c6, and now bishop takes d6. So unloading in the center. Point being that if black takes with the bishop, here comes e5. This time the pawn is even getting involved. And once again, black is done in by the fact that the queen is on d8. White is going to regain the pawn. Even if black brings the knight over to try to take back on d6, they still lose after queen takes e6. Here they even lose a full piece, because if the king moves, we just take the hapless knight. So that was the most devastating way for white to continue. Trade the knights and then take on d6. I think white has great winning chances after that. Steiger07 played a move that is nearly as good, but that would have been even more brutal. So he played knight c4, just retreating the knight and attacking the pawn on d6. Black responded with knight f7. And once again, white had a chance to utilize the same tactical idea. He could have played knight takes d6, bishop takes, knight takes, and then e5 at the very end. And black is in big, big trouble. I like white to convert here. So white played e5 though, but the only criticism of this move is that it gives black a chance to shore up his defenses. And he seized that opportunity. Knoddle played d5, advancing and attempting to keep the d-file closed. Here, you notice that if we take an assessment of the undefended pieces, which I'm always harping on in my videos, The one undefended point in black's camp is the pawn on e6. This pawn, which is in turn defending d5, is vulnerable. And given that d takes c4 is not a threat, again because of the pin, I think white should have played queen g4, looking to keep the initiative alive. And one tactical point I liked after queen g4 is if black plays queen d7, then white has the shot knight takes d5, netting a very valuable pawn, and in fact I think just crushing, because black cannot respond with this because their queen hangs. The queens were in opposition to each other on that diagonal, and black's queen is undefended. So I think queen g4 is the way to keep the fires burning here, hitting that pawn. Instead, Steiger had his eyes on the d6 square, so he played knight b5. And this was a key moment in the game. In the game with Atrophied and Cyanfish, I was talking about how you often do not want to play cooperatively with your opponent. There I was discussing specifically how when you're attacking your opponent, it sometimes makes sense like not to go for obvious checks, forcing your opponent's king out of the danger zone. And here also, I think black committed the error of forcing white to play the move that white wanted to play anyways. So black played a6, which just encouraged white's knight to come into the d6 square. I mean, there's almost no other reason white would play knight b5, right? Like, they have their sights set on d6. So don't waste a tempo and play a6, just forcing them to make the move they want to. Unless you've calculated that allowing knight b to d6 is somehow good. But I think black had better ways to proceed, and one way that the engine really liked here was bishop to h4. Suddenly offering a bishop trade and maybe trying to destabilize white's defense of the e5 square. And if white tries to avoid the trade of bishops, bishop h2, then one thing I noticed in the engine analysis was that after knight h6, black's rook is opened up against f2, and black obtains serious counterplay. And these knights do look intimidating on c4 and b5, but I think it's all bark and no bite for white. I don't see how white's going to follow up with anything significant. So I think this was an important moment in the game, and with a6, black is kind of playing into white's hands. White just gets to play the move they want to play. And here, black compounds the error. You might have heard the saying that mistakes come in threes, or bad things come in threes. And in chess, mistakes often lead to other mistakes. There's kind of this case of like compounding interest when that happens. And here, black plays d takes c4, which allowed knight takes f7. White is not losing any material with this, and suddenly there's an attack on the queen on d8. Very, very bad news. So I think probably their best bet as far as defense was to play bishop takes d6, and then after knight takes d6, play queen e7, and try to batten down the hatches and survive. Yes, white has this nice knight on d6, but black is not down any material. And in fact, I think their position should be completely fine here. But they got to keep the lines closed. Keep that pawn firmly planted on d5, stopping white's play. So instead, d takes c4, knight takes f7. Here black fled with the queen to d6. But white went right back to the d6 square. And now black even experiences problems with the c4 pawn. One line I didn't look at, which I'm kind of wondering about now, is knight to d4. I didn't look at this my first time around in this game, but I wonder, knight d4, trying to attack white's queen. I know black's queen is also hanging. Probably white can just respond with queen takes c4, though. And we're counterattacking here. If we lose the knight on f7, white's going to pick that up. White's up a pawn with a much better position. They're also attacking the queen, and e6 remains weak. So even that doesn't help black. So as played, knight takes f7, queen b6. White withdrew the knight. Black played knight d4 now, but that led to the loss of the c4 pawn. And I think this position is beyond repair for black. I didn't find anything that they could do. The black queen on b6 is attacking f2 and b2. You might think like maybe in conjunction with the rook, black has something, but I think white's knight on d6 is the biggest factor in this position, and it prevents a lot of play that black might otherwise be able to achieve. And as I said, the c4 pawn is a goner. So knight d4, queen takes c4. White's up a pawn. The knight is under attack as well. Black took on d6. White recaptured. Knight still under attack. It has to move, and now queen takes e6. Here white was up 2 pawns and very confidently converted their advantage. Bishop e5. Safe to do this now because only the queen is attacking f2. The rook on f8 is blocked by the knight on f5. Rook a e8. And Steiger07 had this nicely calculated. Black even tried kind of a flashy move here, knight e3, hoping for f takes e3 and then queen takes e3 check, forking the king and the bishop, maybe providing black some hope. But instead, knight e3, white played the observant bishop takes g7 check, drawing the king out, and then queen g5 check, forking the king and the knight. Whereupon he can capture here. Black, to his credit, continued resisting. Rook takes e3. Now white's king is lined up with the black queen on b6, and there's discovered attacks to worry about. So white just simply sidestepped king h1. And now this pawn on d6 and the weakened black king turn out to be insurmountable problems. Black just doesn't have enough here. Rook e2, d7. He can't land a counterpunch or anything. He can't threaten white's king. It's too well protected. So all white did is bring up their forces. And right here, even was able to play the flashy concluding rook, queen takes d8 check. And after queen takes d8, rook c8, black resigned, losing everything. So this was a Smith-Morra gambit that took kind of an offbeat course at the beginning of the game because black played this early knight f6 instead of putting a pawn on d6. I wouldn't really recommend this approach. I think that black would have done best to play knight takes e4 coming up right at this juncture, aiming for the center fork trick after d5. As played, the game really centered around the e5 and the d6 squares. I think black had to recognize early on that their best bet was to play e5 and try to blockade in the center. That would have prevented a lot of problems that they experienced in defending d6. Once white was able to play rook d1, bishop f4, and then h3, the tactics just never worked in black's favor, and white was able to win the pawn back and had some even better ways to really hammer home their advantage. Like here, that line with knight takes c6 followed by bishop takes d6 and e5 probably would have got the job done easier for white. Steiger's move knight c4 was plenty strong as well. Probably the game was truly decided when black made this faulty decision to go for a6, like playing right into his opponent's hands and encouraging white to play the move he wanted to play anyways. Because Knoddel was defending pretty well. I mean, he noticed that after e5, d5 is a good move, closing up the position. And had he avoided a6 and especially d takes c4 on the next move, I think he still had chances in this game. He was still very much in it. Okay, so moving on. Next, we're going to look at Theino versus Jimmy D, quadruple sevens. And this was a win for white, so I'm going to flip it around, look at it from white's point of view. This was also a Sicilian, so we got a nice selection of Sicilian games. And also a nice selection in the sense that each of these Sicilian games proceeded differently. So we've seen an open Sicilian, we just saw a Smith-Morra gambit. Now we're going to see a Sicilian starting with knight c3 on move 2, which can lead to the closed Sicilian, or it can also lead to like a Grand Prix attack if white decides to go f4, as was played in this game. So here black played d6. How you respond to knight c3 kind of depends on what line of the Sicilian you're most comfortable with. For instance, I play the con Sicilian, so I like playing a6 here, because if white plays knight f3 and kind of makes it known that they want to go d4, transposing the game to an open Sicilian, I can play e6, and then after this occurs, I'm right back in my comfort zone in a con. So here black played d6 on move 2. A player who likes the Najdorf or the classical Sicilian or maybe a dragon would probably play this move. If, on the other hand, you play like a Sveshnikov, you probably wouldn't want to do this. So Sveshnikov or a Taimanov or a Khan even, those type of lines. Here white plays f4. I would probably play knight c6 if I were black here. I think it makes sense to try to control the d4 square if white is not playing d4. Instead, Jimmy D plays knight f6. Knight f3, e6, bishop b5 check. I think it was actually interesting for white to play d4, trying to take the game back into open Sicilian territory because they've already played the somewhat desirable move f4. And if black is uncomfortable with the pawns on e6, d6, many Sicilian players don't play with that center, this might have been a good decision for white. Instead, bishop b5 check. Black could block with either the bishop or the queenside knight. They choose to block with the queenside knight, knight bd7. And here white does play d4. After which we kind of have a offbeat position, which in turn leads to a normal-looking Sicilian middle game in a short while. Black plays a6 here, kicking the bishop. White decides that he doesn't want to just part with the light square bishop. I think correct call. He moves the bishop back to d3. Black plays queen c7, just bringing the queen to a good square. From c7, it has influence down the c-file, and it also discourages white from playing pawn e5. So it fits in well with black's setup. Bishop e3. Black goes to fianchetto their light square bishop. Here white plays a3. Often, when I'm on the black side of a Sicilian and white plays a3 as a means to discourage b4, I feel pretty good with my position because it almost feels like a concession most of the time. White's slowing down and acknowledging that b4, pushing the knight away, is a significant threat. I think I would have continued with just bishop e7 if I were black here. Black played knight c5, though, which also is plenty valid. He's bringing another attacker to bear down on e4. White plays queen f3 defending. Black plays bishop e7. And now white brings the rook over, rook ae1. And we have a utterly standard attacking array for white and also a standard position for black in defense. Now here, if we are trying to brainstorm some candidate moves for black, I think there's one move that comes to mind pretty easily, and that's to castle. In such situations, you really don't want to go queenside. Going kingside would be much more normal for black, which is in fact what Jimmy D did. He castled short. But there's also this intriguing option of playing h5, which, as the arrow indicates, introduces the possibility of knight to g4, hitting the bishop on e3. And I think if you're like a con player or some sort of Sicilian player, this could happen in a lot of lines, honestly, you might want to think about playing h5. It injects some dynamic potential in the position. Obviously, you're going to be hesitant to castle short if you do play h5, but I want you to be aware of this idea if you get into these positions. If white plays h3, trying to discourage knight g4, then black often continues with h4, looking to go like knight h5 and into g3 at a later date. But black played the safer move, castle short. White played bishop f2, just allowing the rook to coordinate with the pawn on e4. Black played rook c8. And here white played queen h3. And as you can see with the arrows, queen h3, the principal idea is to advance e5 and get the bishop involved in the attack on h7. So let's just say we play like a couple oblivious moves for black. Let's say rook fd8, e5, take on e5, take on e5. You can see that white's rook, because of that bishop f2 move, is defending the pawn. Now, black would really need to play knight takes d3 here. Not sure how that would work out after e takes f6. But say black move the knight away, well, they're going to get crunched after queen takes h7. They're just going to get mated in a couple moves. So when you see a queen h3 type of move in this setup, white usually has bishop d3 in mind, that bishop lurking, trying to coordinate with the queen to attack h7. Therefore, Jimmy D decided to play knight takes d3, which I think is fine. The bishop does seem a little bit lame, but if that pawn comes up there, you might want to eliminate it. I think it's also possible for black to play h6 here. This was the engine's top move, simply blocking the attack and keeping more tension. But hard to argue with knight takes d3. White took back with the pawn. Black played knight d7, a bit of a prophylactic move, but they might want to maneuver this piece. And also they're getting ready to bring their bishop to f6. Here white played knight ce2. Looking at this position, it's a little hard for me to say exactly how white should proceed because that bishop was a big element to their attack. You might think that white should throw their pawns up the board, but both e5 and f5 entail drawbacks. They weaken some squares in their wake. So I think white was just content to maneuver. Maybe he had in mind something like knight g3 to h5, sending the knight around. So I think it's fine. Here black played bishop f6. And this might have been white's real big plan, actually. Even instead of knight g3 to h5, he played rook c1, switching the rook over to the c-file. Part of me thinks this is inconsistent with the way white has arranged their forces, like suddenly switching back to the queen side. They don't have any pieces on the a-file through the c-file, whereas black has a few. So it's hard to believe that white could like seize the initiative over here. But there is one nice point to this move, and that's if black is careless, there might be a tactic involving knight takes e6 coming up. And just to illustrate what I mean, let's say that black plays queen b8 here, trying to hide their queen. Then rook takes c8, and if black makes the normal recapture, rook takes c8, suddenly knight takes e6, and white is winning material because f takes e6, queen takes e6 check is a fork on the king and the knight. White comes out on top. Also note that after rook c1, black cannot play queen to b6 for exactly the same reason. Queen b6 goes right into the line of fire with this bishop on f2. Knight takes e6 is going to hurt that discovery, also hitting the rook on f8. So I think after rook c1, black kind of panicked. You can tell by the move they played next. Either they panicked or they were overly optimistic about this coming sacrifice. Queen b8 was probably still fine. I think just after rook takes c8, if black takes with, say, the bishop, ensuring that this knight on d7 is defended, they would have been totally good to go here. Here, knight takes e6 is not working because, again, the knight is supported by the bishop. So instead, Jimmy D decides to take on d4, unexpectedly offering their queen. And theino didn't need to say, or didn't need to second guess his decision to take the queen. He just chopped it right off. Rook takes c7, and then bishop takes f2 check, rook takes f2, and rook takes c7. So black has a rook plus a minor piece for the queen, but not much else. I guess he has the c-file, but it shouldn't make up full compensation for the queen. White is clearly better here. That said, there's still some complications. So white plays f5. Black wisely closes the position, e5. Here white plays knight c3. He might have wanted to block the file, so I think this move is understandable. Black doubles. White plays queen g4. Here f6 could be a threat, trying to use the pin on the g7 pawn. So Jimmy D plays knight f6, hitting the queen. And here I think white got a tad ambitious. I just don't like the move they played because it doesn't seem like a realistic way to attack black, the move that white chose here. They played queen g5. I think the idea is rook f3, rook g3, and hit the pawn and also threaten queen takes f6, but it's too slow. So they probably should have just played queen e2, retreating the queen to the second rank, and I don't see anything immediate that black can do here. If black tries to break in the center with d5, they might even run into some issues with this hanging pawn on e5. So white should have just retreated and tried to utilize their slight material advantage. Maybe even after queen e2, it's possible to continue g4, g5, and pawn storm white, trying to attack without the major pieces. But instead, that queen g5 move was played, and black responded with h6, hitting the queen. Again, white could have brought the queen back to, like, say, d2, but they chose queen h4. And now black didn't pass up the opportunity to strike back. So they played d5. Great timing on this move. They've diffused the threats on the king side for now, and they realized that they needed open lines. So d5 creates some tension between the e4 and the d5 pawns. White played rook f3. You can understand that white was hesitant to take on d5. I think if take, let's say knight takes, bishop takes, then this rook can invade at any moment. Just to illustrate, like maybe something like this happens, and if white ever plays rook f1, then rook here and black will be attacking g2. This is kind of a fantasy variation. I don't think white would allow this, but it just shows you that if black gets their pieces coordinated, they do have significant counter arguments. But they need to open lines, and d5 does exactly that. Here white played rook f3. So white clearly has ideas in mind involving rook g3 still. If they get a chance to play rook g3, then these two moves will be threats. For that reason, I think black should have continued opening lines and played d takes e4, not losing any time. But instead, black played d4. This move doesn't exactly lose time, but I think if white had responded correctly, it wouldn't have worked out so well. So after d4, white has a choice of where to move the knight. And I'll give you those two moves, knight e2 or knight a2. Which of those moves do you think white should play? So only two options. One of them is definitely right. One of them is definitely wrong. And if you want to pause your video and figure out which one white should prefer, you can do that now. All right, so this gets a little complicated, but I think white should play the seemingly passive knight a2. And the reason is the knight is shielded from attacks on this square. The problem you'll see with knight e2 is that black is able to bring the rook in to c2 with tempo on that knight, and black starts to get a lot of counterplay. Instead, knight a2 also allows some counterplay after rook c2, but white can respond with rook f2, after which the computer gave a really weird line. I'm just going to show it to you without much explanation. It says black can play bishop takes e4, d takes e4, d3, trying to use the d pawn to create some problems. And then the best move, again, don't ask me why, is queen h3, d2, queen d3, trying to stop the pawn, to which black can respond with knight takes e4. The queen is overloaded. It was trying to defend e4 and also stop d1 queen. And then rook f1, rook c1, knight c3, and the unexpected follow-up, rook 8 takes c3, b takes c3, and this produces a weird position where black can even play a calm move like f6, and it's almost like I hesitate to use the word stalemate, but it's like a standoff situation. White can't ever eliminate this d-pawn comfortably because it's defended by the knight, nor can they eliminate the knight, because if they do this, then black is taking on f1 and promoting on the next move. So I don't know what the heck is happening in this line, but suffice it to say that knight a2 was a better option because rook c2 does not come with tempo on the knight. You'll see that after d4, knight e2, white experiences a lot of problems. So black did play rook c2. Here I think white should play knight g3 and try to get the knight over to the king side, maybe even up to h5. But he played king f1, to which black responded with the understandable rook takes b2. Now this rook is ready to join the attacking equation with rook c to c2. Rook g3. And here's the final question I'll ask you about this game. So we've had some fireworks. Black sacrificed their queen and is suddenly obtaining a lot of play for it. How do you think black should proceed? If you want to pause your video and figure that out, you can do so now. Okay, so black needed a prophylactic move at this juncture. So black could have played king h7, which is a real tidy move to address white's main threat. White's main threat is queen takes f6. Queen takes h6 maybe, but mostly eliminating the knight. And king h7 would have just been a simple way to diffuse that. And I don't think white has anything here. I think they're done in by their overly ambitious ways because they can't move their queen to attack g7. You can see that g5 and g4 are both covered. And I think white's just going to fizzle and black's ready to bring the big guns in. Rook c to c2. The game is won for black. Instead, though, Jimmy D, bless his heart, I mean, he wanted to mate white. He had this queen sacrifice in mind way back when. The more I think about it, it was probably an attacking decision by him to do that. And he's thinking, wow, this game's going great. Let's play rook c c2. But he just overlooked white's threat. Queen takes f6. And black had to resign here. There's no good way to proceed. If he takes on e2, he's getting mated. Queen takes g7. So tragic. One oversight at the very end of the game cost black. But that's chess for you. Chess is often called the tragedy of a single move or the tragedy of a single tempo. And you see that on display here. But heroic effort by black to really come back and prove compensation for the queen sacrifice. I don't think it was sound, but the way that Jimmy D played it, I liked how he drummed up the counterplay. Complex attacking game. Probably white played in too straightforward of a manner. They pinned all their hopes on counterattacking black's king, whereas I think they should have just brought their queen back, like for instance on this move right here after knight f6. I think just queen e2 and playing to defend against some of black's threats on the queen side would have been fine, and white has good chances to win. But nice contest. I think this game, as many of these games did, kind of embodies the spirit of this league. It seems like people were playing very creatively and really letting it all hang out on the board. Okay, so next one is JPTriton versus Droodjerky. Let's go to that game. This was quite a long game. I'll try to give you guys the Cliff Notes version, of course. I know this video is already going long. This one was a draw, and it was a Nimzo Larsen with b3 on move 1. To which Droodjerky responded with e5, bishop b2, knight c6, defending the pawn, e3. Here black played a6, just stopping any attempt by white to pressure the knight on c6 with bishop b5. White played c4, staking out some space in the center. Knight f6, knight c3, d5, take. We get kind of a reverse Sicilian position where white has 2 center pawns to black's 1. White played knight f3. Here, I think if I were black, I would have played knight takes c3, bishop takes c3, and then e4, advancing and hitting the knight. Instead, black played bishop e6. White responded with the capture, which does open up a double attack on the e5 pawn. This is the one thing I don't like about black's decision to reinforce with the bishop here. So, knight takes d5. Black played queen takes d5 in reply, because otherwise they can't defend the pawn on e5. If they had to take with the bishop, they would just end up losing this pawn. So queen takes d5, white played bishop c4, hitting the queen, queen d6, and then we had opposite side castling, so castles, and black castled long. I think this is incorrect for black to do. With the half-open c-file, you're always going to be hesitant to do this. If you think about like the open Sicilian, there are a lot of lines where white does castle queenside, even though black has a half-open c-file. But given that white is kind of the one playing the open Sicilian, it's an open Sicilian in reverse, I think white's a bit better prepared to take action on the queen side compared to black on the king side. So in other words, I think white has an easier time of creating an attack. White might just be faster here. White played d4, opening the center a little bit. Black played e4 in reply. And here white needed to go forward, knight g5. This would have been a nice way to hit all 3 of those highlighted squares, e4, e6, and f7. And I think if this were to occur, black has some question marks in their position. They might even be just losing a pawn. Instead, JPTriton retreated the knight to d2. Black supported the pawn with f5. Rook to c1 was played, lining up with the king. And here black played rook g8, looking to initiate their own attacking aspirations by virtue of continuing with g5. Notice that if g5 is played right away, then d5 could be a strong counterattack, hitting the undefended rook in the corner. A lot of times it's sensible just to tuck your king away, though, and especially when your opponent has a rook on the c-file lined up with your king. I think before anything else, I would have just played king b8 and ensured that I don't run into problems because of that. But rook g8 was played. White played a3, and now both sides prepare their pawn storms. Here we had a trade on c4. White took with the knight, hitting the queen. Queen d5. White sent the queen to e2 here, connecting the rooks. I think c2 is a bit better of a square, just to emphasize white's play down the c-file. Knight e5 maybe could be a way white could continue, trying to attack c6 multiple ways. So queen e2, black played bishop d6. Here white took on d6. Black took with the rook. Now here, white had a pretty logical way to further their attack, and I think they could have done that with rook c5. So lifting the rook with tempo, hitting the queen, and then after, say, queen f7, bringing the other rook over. And I like white's chances here. I think, especially with this pawn on a6, white might be able to explode the queen side by playing b5 and forcing some trades. So this would have been a good continuation for them. Instead, after rook fd1, black swings the rook over to h6, and white incorrectly decides to break with the pawn now. Had they played rook c5 first, as in the previous line, and then maybe continued with b5 thereafter, I could understand this. But b5 now I don't like because black had queen takes b5 in reply, attacking the white queen and also eyeing the bishop on b2. And this would have slowed white down. As played, though, after b5, black took with the pawn, and white did get rook c5 in. So black was a bit accommodating here, recapturing in the way that was most favorable to white, as opposed to queen takes b5. So a takes b5, rook c5. Black played queen d6. Note that queen d6 contains the threat of capturing on h2, so white must defend against that threat before going after the b5 pawn. So JPTriton does that with g3. And here black makes kind of a change of mind. He plays rook h to g6. Maybe he figured that the h file wasn't panning out, and maybe he's pinning his hopes on a breakthrough like f4 and wants his rook as backup. Nevertheless, this does leave the pawn on f5 hanging. I was talking about the pawn on b5, but I probably should have also mentioned that rook c5 attacks that f5 pawn as well. So rook takes f5. Black does make the best of kind of a loose situation here, though, by playing queen e6, hitting the rook. Rook takes b5. And now all of a sudden, he plays the rook back to h6. And maybe, just maybe, Droodjerky had this planned out. Like rook g6 kind of lulling white into taking the pawn, and then abruptly bringing the rook back to h6 a couple moves later. And now with black's queen ready to swoop into h3, it seems that black is the one who's ahead in the attacking department, even though white has grabbed that pawn on f5. I somehow doubt that that was black's intention with rook g6, just because it does seem like an awkward move. But you never know. And again, if anyone who played these games is watching and wants to chime in with what their thoughts were during the game, feel free. I'd love to hear that, as I'm sure the viewers would. So here white played queen f1. This does address the queen h3 threat. White just covers that square. And this position's complicated, no doubt. I think the move that black played, rook h3, is incorrect. I probably would have played... Well, I don't know if I would have played this move. The computer liked knight e7, and I can kind of understand why this move is attractive. If you can bring the knight up to d5 to blockade, that would be quite nice. Also, maybe the knight could participate in some attacking way. On c6, it's not really doing much. So getting that knight into a more active role is attractive. But then again, the position's pretty messy and complex. The other reason why knight e7 should strongly be considered is that white is threatening d5 here, forking the queen and the knight. So I was trying to find some other rationale for knight e7, but that's probably the reason the engine likes that move so much. So rook h3, and white did indeed continue with d5. Black responded with queen h6, hitting the pawn on h2. Now, if white would have proceeded with queen g2 here, simply taking a moment out of his attacking schedule to defend the pawn on h2, I think white was going to win this game. Because then this knight would have to retreat, and black doesn't have any good way to follow up on the king side. Whereas I think there are some clear ways white could go after black's king. Maybe involving, like, let's just say knight e7, maybe rook c1 here, preparing a move like bishop e5, possibly d6 as well, because if the queen were to take, the rook on h3 would be loose. And this rook on h3 actually looks like a liability to me if black's queen is needed to babysit it. So after queen h6, I know taking the knight is tempting, but queen g2 would have shut down black's threats on h2 and probably won the game for white. Instead, white chopped the knight. Rook takes h2 is played. Now white has to be quick because black is threatening mate in 2. Rook h1, king g2, and then queen h2 or queen h3. So if you were white here, you're going to have to give the material back to avoid mate. And what do you think is the best way to do that? So white to move, if you want to figure out the best way white can return the material, you can do so now. Okay, so white should play c takes b7, king to b8, and now queen g2, stopping rook h1. And after rook takes g2, king takes g2, we have an imbalanced position. White has a rook and bishop and one extra pawn against black's queen, so it is materially equal. But I think this pawn on b7 is a huge concern to black, and black has a hard time eliminating that pawn. And I believe the engine was saying that white is better here. Obviously still very messy, though. I would pin my bet on white, though. Instead, JPTriton just kind of made a move order mistake. He played queen g2 straight away, but then this similar line occurred, but he didn't win the pawn on b7. Black was able to take on c6. And now the tables have turned somewhat. Here white played rook d5. Black played g4. Still a messy position, though. Black has some concerns about their king safety, that pawn on c7 in particular, which white conjured up a way to further assault Black's king. So bishop e5 attacking c7, c6, rook d6, queen f5. And here, I really liked how white proceeded. So he played rook a5, introducing rook a8 check, which would force Black's king to c7, which with a bishop on e5, I don't think you're comfortable doing that. The position sharpened up in a hurry. Black played rook g5, check, king here. Now the challenge for white in this position is to find a good discovery, because all the discoveries that white would like to make, especially rook f6, would lose the bishop, and white would lose the game as a result. So JPTriton, again, came up with a good move. He played bishop to f4. So securing the bishop. This also stops queen f3 check, which is a move Black may consider at some stage. And Black responded with a strong move as well. King b6, just escaping the discoveries. A mature decision, because if Black were to move the rook, again, he's going to fall victim to the rook f6 discovery. Also note that queen takes f4 would not work, because even though Black can snatch the rook, his other rook would be hanging at the end of the line, and white would be up an entire rook. So great back and forth right there, with white creating threats in a complicated position, and Black responding in a strong way as well, especially this move king b6. I know it's forced, but still impressive that these guys are figuring that out in a complex game. And also, I don't know if time was a factor too. That's another thing. So here, JPTriton took on g5, and now we enter a two rooks versus queen endgame that, I got to be honest, is pretty tough to analyze. I did analyze the rest of the game, and I'm going to show you some of the highlights, but it's kind of like dynamically balanced from this point forward. If we count the material, it's equal. Black has a queen plus a pawn against white's two rooks. And I think the big factor will be whether Black can create sufficient problems with their c-pawn, or whether white will be able to coordinate their rooks and prove that the rooks are mightier than the c-pawn plus the queen. And probably the true answer to what should properly happen is it's just a draw. There's a lot of perpetual checks that are possible as well. Proceeding with the game forward, here white played that rook d7 move, which attacks the pawns on h7 and b7. Black decided to save the b pawn, which I think is correct. And here white took on h7. I think the engine was saying a4 check was a bit better, just throwing this in to kind of force Black's king to the c5 square. As if he goes to a5, for instance, then rook a7 is actually checkmate. So if a4, king c5, on the other hand, it might be harder to advance this pawn. So instead of gobbling on h7, maybe white could have thrown that in. Rook takes h7, c5. Here white gave a check, but Black went right back to c6. Rook d to d7. White does not want the rooks split up. When you have two rooks against a queen, you almost always need your rooks coordinated. Otherwise, the queen will be too powerful. Here Black played queen e6, threatening to take on d7. Rook b7, queen d6, covering the c7 square. And now here, white had a strong possibility, which is something that you probably are only going to truly appreciate with the aid of the engine, and that's rook a7. The idea is that even though Black is ready to start advancing this c-pawn, then white can respond with a5. And white's a-pawn is strong in its own right. If Black tries to push past with b5, then the point of the rook being on a7 is revealed. White has rook a6 check, skewering the king and the queen. Game over. So that's kind of a subtle repositioning of the rook. So rook a7, idea a5, and trying to get at Black's king on the 6th rank. Instead, white played rook he7. Black advanced c4. And now white tried this move a5, but it didn't quite have the same effect. Take, rook a7, looking for rook a6. Black went king b5. Now I would say the momentum is swinging in Black's favor, because white just had to give up a pawn, and it's not immediately clear what white gains for that pawn. Rook d7. Again, white is not stopping to disconnect the rooks. I think if they do something like this, then they're running the risk of kind of getting pinned down, and the c-pawn is only a few squares away from promoting, so if they had to take a timeout to do something like this, I guess there's some issue with maybe rook e5 being a threat, but let's say king b4. I just don't think this is a situation white wants to find themselves in with this rook under fire and pinned. So white plays a game of tickle, as Danny Wrench would say, by attacking the queen. Black ran their king up the board. Again, white attacking the queen. When such a situation starts occurring, you think it may end in a draw because white's just going to chase black's queen endlessly. But to both players' credit, I think they were both playing for the win, to be honest. Like here, certainly white could have considered just playing rook e7, going after the queen further, but he instead plays rook c7, trying to attack that pawn on c4. And black goes queen c3, hiding his queen. He says no more attacks for now. Then white plays rook to b1. Here I think the engine was saying rook b8 was a good move, trying to double up the rooks behind the c-pawn. Again, pretty complicated and quite possibly should end in a draw because let's say something like queen c1 occurs, rook here, king b4 trying to defend. White certainly cannot trade into the pawn endgame. They're just going to lose that after the a-pawn runs. But should that black king go to b4, white could always give a check here and force the king away. Maybe we get some sort of repetition like rook to c8. So instead, queen c3, white played that rook b1 move. Black moved their king up the board. He's advancing his king, sheltered by his own pawns. Rook d1. Here black played queen c2. I think king b3 might have been good, trying to get the king even into c2. Instead, queen c2, white gave a check. King b4 defending the a5 pawn. Rook check, king c3. And white succeeded in winning this pawn. Black played king d2, though. The struggle continues, even though one pawn has been lost. I think it might have been sensible for black to play queen d1 here. This is my first instinct when looking at this quite complicated scenario, is I like the fact that this always gives the option of queen f3 check with a potential perpetual. So I probably would have played that. Instead, king d2. White gets behind the pawn. King e2. Rook a1, controlling the first rank. I didn't analyze this in my notes, but I wonder if after rook c5, probably the idea for black is to shed the c-pawn and play queen d1, but then getting in an incredibly valuable check on f1, after which, at the very least, black has a draw and might even be able to play for a win here. I don't see a mating net off the top of my head, but yeah, white's the one who has to be careful now. So very clever attacks and counterattacks that really characterize this entire set of games. So white played rook a1, guarding the first rank. Queen b2, rook c to a7, introducing rook a2 as an idea. Black backed off with their queen and also hit f2. Check, king d3. Check again, king c3. This king is journeying around. Rook a to d2, doubling up. King b4, rook d4. King b3 looking to push the pawn. Black succeeds in doing so. Now white decides to kind of set up kind of a fortress on the first rank. And as soon as c2 is played, then plays rook d2. And here black plays the queen in. And even though after we get a trade on c2, white is up a pawn, white is unable to win because of their poor king position and the fact that these pawns are so well advanced and control the f3 square. So this all occurred, again, just to back up for a second. Black played c2, and after rook d2, they swapped everything on c2. But it fizzled now because white just can't slip a passed pawn by. White played king f1. Black went king d2. And just to illustrate that, maybe this will be the final question for this game. If white plays f4 now, how do you think the game should proceed? So black to move after f4, what should black do? All right, this is a really cool line. So it goes g takes f3 en passant, g4, king takes e3, g5, white's pawn is sprinting, f2, g6, king f3, G7, E3, G8 queen, and E2 checkmate. So I don't know if both players calculated that out, but that would have been a thrilling conclusion had white attempted to win with F4. So JPTriton, if you figured out that F4 is losing, nice job. He instead played King G2, and then after King E2, King G1, King E1, the players agree to draw because white's king is encaged and black cannot win, clearly. I mean, they're never going to win the F2 pawn. So draw agreed. So long game. This is the longest of the set, I believe. It was 73 moves. Pretty fascinating endgame with 2 rooks against the queen, which was initiated by this whole sequence where white had the discovered attack potential with the bishop, and black was therefore forced to give back some material. I know I glossed over a lot of that. I'm going to post the PGNs to these games, probably the link to the Lichess analysis, so you can take a closer look yourself. But yeah, this one, fun game to play through. Very much so. I think that end game, especially given the ratings of the players, was of an extremely high standard, because it would be so easy in that 2 rooks versus queens endgame for just one side to make an obvious blunder, but I couldn't find many obvious blunders. Just scrolling through my annotations, both sides played pretty precisely. So awesome job, guys. All right, so on to the final game. I know this video has been going for a while, so if you've been watching this entire video through, thank you, first of all, and I hope it's been educational. So final game, Obucheniye versus SheepNL. This one was also kind of long, but it was pretty much decided at an earlier stage than the last game. So we're going to look at this from white's point of view. So white opened with D4, black responded with E6, C4, knight F6, knight C3. Now, normally black would play bishop to B4 and enter the Nimzo-Indian, but here SheepNL decided to play B6. And I think they're kind of mixing systems with this move. This is a move characteristic of the Queen's Indian defense, which if you've been watching the candidates tournament, you've seen a lot of, like Sergei Karyakin has seemingly been playing this opening every single game. But the Queen's Indian proper is introduced if white plays knight F3 on move 3, and then black plays B6. So if white plays knight C3 on move 3 and black plays B6 here, let's try to deduce why this would be an inferior move order. Like, why is B6 not often played here? And if you want to pause your video and figure that out, you can do so now. So the answer is B6 here allows white to continue with E4, just taking the center. The knight on C3 supports that pawn. A knight on F3 would not have. So hence black can get away with B6 much easier. But with the knight on C3, I see no reason not to occupy the center, E4. Instead, though, white played E3. Probably they were somewhat autopiloting some of these moves. And after bishop B7, knight F3, we are back in a semi-normal position. Black played D5. Again, bishop B4 is possible, but D5 also makes sense. White played bishop E2. D takes C4. Bishop takes C4. You could argue that maybe white should avoid bishop E2 and try to play some other useful move, like let's say bishop D2, hoping that black takes on C4 now and white gets to develop their bishop in one fell swoop to the C4 square. But I don't know. I mean, it's actually kind of hard to find a good developing move for white here. Bishop D2, I'm not convinced is so useful. And also, black may not take on C4. That's the other thing. Black doesn't have to capture that pawn. So bishop E2, we get this trade. And SheepNL strikes at Obucheniye's center, C5. White castles. Now, often when you have a pawn on C5, it makes sense to try to follow up with A6 and B5. Sometimes you can even do A6 and B5 before pushing C5. So I think I would have played that if I were black. A6, B5 is a great square to guard, and it just looks like a handy move to play. Instead, black played bishop E7. White went queen E2. Black castled. And I think here the proper way to proceed is with D takes C5. And then let's say bishop takes C5, and then E4. Now that the queens are not opposing each other on the E file, there's no fear of a queen trade. And the queen is perfectly situated on e2 along with the knight on c3 to support this e-pawn advance. So I like the way this looks. It reminds me a lot of a Queen's Gambit accepted. And if white can continue with something like bishop g5 and e5, rook d1 with tempo on the black queen, they're love and life. I think white will obtain a nice position. I don't think black's in huge trouble or anything here, but this looks sensible for white. Instead, white played rook d1 now, and there was a trade on d4. White recaptured with the e-pawn, voluntarily accepting an isolated pawn. I thought knight takes d4 was interesting because then the d-file is not blocked, and white may consider sacrificing on e6. So let's say knight b d7. The computer didn't like this so much at this juncture, but I would think about playing bishop takes e6, f takes e6, and then knight takes e6, forking the queen and the rook. And if it doesn't work here, it could be a theme later. So I probably would have played knight takes d4. Instead, e takes d4, and black blockaded the d5 square, knight d5. This is a smart move because if white is allowed, they may continue with d5 themselves, trying to open lines towards the black queen. So in an IQP scenario, if black can defend the d5 square, blockade that square at an early juncture without any obvious consequence, then I think it makes sense for them to do that. Now white embarked on kind of an aggressive plan. They played knight e4. I think bishop d2 might have been a better way to proceed, just developing and reinforcing c3, but I got to hand it to white. The plan that they came up with was creative. So they played knight e4, black played knight d7, and now knight eg5. Black played knight 7 to f6, and white played knight e5. The fact that knight e5 is possible kind of makes me question whether black should play knight 7 f6 here, but then again, it wouldn't have led to the cool stuff coming up if if black had avoided playing that. So knight e5, black played rook c8. Now, white played bishop b3 at this juncture, just retreating the bishop, ensuring that rook takes c4 will never be a threat. But I thought knight e takes f7 was very interesting and the natural follow-up to white's previous play, trying to get the knights to e5 and g5. So if you want to calculate what should happen after knight e takes f7, you can do so now. So in other words, how should the game continue? Black to move. From here, the game could go rook takes f7, and now queen takes e6. Good job if you saw this move. Knight takes f7 would win the rook, but after king takes f7, black gets to keep that valuable e6 pawn. So queen takes e6 is much stronger, double attacking the pin rook on f7. And then best is rook takes c4, knight takes f7, queen c8, offering a queen for queen trade. And the correct result here, I believe, is a draw. Note that if white plays knight d6 check, hoping to win the black queen next, then they would suffer a reversal after queen takes e6, just losing their queen. So white might consider, and they should, play the double check, knight h6. And after king h8, knight f7, we would have a perpetual. King g8, knight h6, etc. Note that white is not in a position to set up the glorified smothered mate with queen g8, because even though knight takes g8, knight f7 is checkmate, black doesn't have to respond with knight takes g8. He can play queen takes g8. And after knight takes g8, king takes g8, black has way too many minor pieces. He has 3 minor pieces for the rook, and black is winning. So that's the best line after knight e takes f7. There's some tactical fireworks that work out to a draw. Instead, though, white played that patient move, bishop to b3, maybe looking for a better time to strike. And here, black played h6. Now, this is a little bit different because if white responds with knight g takes f7, that's not as good as the previous line because after rook takes f7, there's no queen takes e6 move. That's the difference now that we're sacrificing the g knight rather than the e knight. And if knight takes f7, king takes f7, I'm liking black because e6 is stable. I generally prefer the minor pieces against the rook when I have a clear choice between the two, as do most stronger players, it seems to me. So white had to retreat the knight, so he played knight g to f3. And here, SheepNL played kind of passive move. I don't quite understand this move. He played knight h7, just going backwards. And this doesn't like hurt him too much or anything, but I can think of some other potentially useful moves. Like maybe rook c7 is a decent move, defending along the 7th rank, sometimes preparing like even queen to a8. Also, black could try to play knight d7, offering a knight for knight trade. Knight h7 just seems like a step in the wrong direction. White played rook e1. Probably wasn't happy with this rook on d1 now that the d pawn is so firmly blockaded. Also, bishop d2 could be played, just developing. So rook e1, and here SheepNL continues with his plan. He plays knight g5. So in fairness to him, knight h7 did have a point. I guess he just wanted to reroute the knight. Knight takes g5, bishop takes g5. And here, I like the look of queen to g4 for white. I thought this was the proper way to proceed. And there could be some simplifications, like say bishop takes c1, rook takes c1. But in the end, I think white's queen being on g4, creating threats on, or some pressure on e6 and g7, maybe gives white a slight pull here. Although if black can play queen g5 and swap, I'm not so sure about that. But still, I think queen g4 is a good way to proceed. Also, queen g4 covers the f4 square. I think white was concerned about that because they played g3, also trying to reinforce f4. Black played queen e7. White played a3, covering the b4 square. Rook fd8. And now white struck with h4. And here is where black makes an unfortunate decision. I think if black would have played just bishop f6, calmly retreating, they have a slightly better position now. I don't believe white has gained much by playing g3 and h4. It looks like they're weakening themselves. It's move 22 now, and white still hasn't developed the dark square bishop. Black has a nice grip on some key central squares, and their rooks are participating. I would take black if push came to shove. Instead, though, black decided to play this bishop sacrifice. So they played bishop takes h4, which needlessly allows white to go up material. G takes h4, queen takes h4. And now, admittedly, black has some threats. You could imagine if this knight gets a chance to move, like even a move like knight f4 or knight c3, both moves attacking the white queen, then this bishop lurking on b7 will join up with the black queen for a checkmate on h1. So that's the main threat that white has to sidestep. And white did so by playing queen to g4, offering a queen trade. Queen f3, I think, is also good, by the way, attacking the f7 pawn. So queen to g4. And if black trades the queens now, then white will be looking forward to consolidating their slight material edge in the endgame. So SheepNL tries to keep the queens on the board, queen f6. And finally, white develops this dark square bishop. Better late than never, right? It's move 24, but he finally got that piece into the game, bishop e3. Knight e7. Creative move by black, opening up the bishop's diagonal and also looking to put the knight on f5 in many cases. White plays rook c1. Black does play knight f5. White plays bishop c2. The problem for black is they've put all their eggs in one basket now. By virtue of this sacrifice that they made a few moves ago, they're obligated to attack. And white just has too many pieces around their king. They have no pawn cover around their king, but the queen on g4, for instance, does a great job of covering some vulnerable squares. So it's just not enough compensation. Knight h4, white played bishop e4, looking to trade the bishops and neutralize some of black's play. And here I like the move that black played. They played h5, trying to deflect the white queen. White played queen f4. Bishop takes e4, queen takes e4. Note that if queen takes f4, then bishop takes f4, and white's rook on e1 is the piece that defends e4 now. Even in the case of this move, white can retreat with the bishop and keep that rook defending the bishop. So black took on e4, white took with the queen, knight f5. White played knight to c6. Queen g6 check. Here white has to be careful where they move the queen or move their king. Or if they don't want to move their king, they can play the move they played in the game, queen g2. Because note that if king h1, black's idea is to continue knight g3 check, forking the king and the queen. Take, and then queen takes queen. Black wins. That said, I think king h2 would have been a good move here for white. That stays out of checking distance of this knight, and white may even consider bringing a rook over the g-file and try to counterattack a little bit. Instead, white played just queen to g2, offering a queen trade, and black saw nothing better than to accept that, which makes sense because his rook on d8 is also hanging, so he doesn't have a lot of time to do stuff. So queen takes g2 check, king takes g2, black plays rook d7. And here, I believe bishop f4 would have been an accurate move for white, controlling the c7 square and stopping black from doubling up. Note that white would like to play knight e7 here to get at the rook on c8, but black has knight takes e7 in reply, defending that rook. So that would be disastrous. So the point of bishop f4 is that even though we lose a defender of the d4 pawn, black cannot afford to take it because now knight e7 actually works. Black has no knight takes e7 in reply, so white is just going to scoop the rook on c8. So after rook d7, instead of bishop f4, white played rook e2, king f8, and now the nice simplifying move, knight e5, hitting both of the rooks. This rook attacking c8, knight attacking d7. Black could insert this capture, but I don't think it makes a lick of difference. White can take back either way, let's say with the pawn, and black is still going to have to swap a pair of rooks. And swaps are good for white because we are ahead a tiny bit of material. We're up 1 point of material. We welcome exchanges if everything else is equal. So black played rook d to c7. We got a trade of the rooks. White played the knight back to f3. Not sure this is the best move. Maybe white was just wanting to defend d4 a bit better. I think the key for black resisting here is to try to utilize this pawn mass. He's got pawns on the e file through the h file, and he needs to put them to use. Hence, I like the computer suggestion of playing f6 here, looking to control the g5 and the e5 squares and maybe trying to push g5 and perhaps g4 thereafter. If he could start pushing ahead with these pawns, and ideally win the d4 pawn, like maybe pile up with the rook and also the knight that's already attacking it, then black has good chances to survive. I think with proper play, white is the one pressing here, but black's got to unlock these pawns. Nothing else will do. Instead, black plays knight d6, which allows bishop f4, attacking that knight, and that knight is pinned. He would lose the rook behind if he moved it. Black brought the king up. Here white played knight d2, intending to go knight e4 and pump up the pressure on d6. I also thought d5 was intriguing. So trying to trade off the weak d pawn for the pawn on e6, thereby splitting black's pawns. But ironically, white's move knight d2 wins him the game tactically, because here black makes a big blunder. He plays rook to c2. And if you want to figure out why this is a game-losing blunder, you can do so now. So white to move and win, feel free to pause your video and figure out how white gets the job done. So, straightforward. White can take on d6 with check. And unfortunately for black, if king takes d6, knight e4 also comes with check. Black has to move the king. We win the rook. White's up a rook and wins the game. So, as played after bishop takes d6, SheepNL decided to play king d7, but now he's down 2 minor pieces for only 2 pawns, and the game proceeded for another 20 moves, but at no point was black even close to saving this. I'm just going to flick through the moves real quickly. White had no trouble in wrapping up the game. As you can see, black's pawns never got going until the final moments, and it was way too late. Probably black's only hope here is a stalemate of some kind, but he's got even too many pieces on the board. And here, white allowed the knight to be captured. Rook takes e5, but after rook a8 check, he resigned because he saw that if king g7, I think bishop c3 is the easiest way to win, pinning the rook. White wins. So this one was a IQP position, isolated queen's pawn position, where white introduced this maneuver, which I haven't really seen before, where he brings the queenside knight around to the g5 square, and then follows up with knight e5, creating tremendous pressure against f7 and e6. I would have loved to see how the game would have proceeded if white had pulled the trigger on knight e takes f7 here. Because again, the key thing is that white's queen has access to the e6 square, and white should not get more than a draw with best play, but then again, black is the one who has to be accurate. I guess both sides have to be accurate to some extent. As played, even though black played the slightly questionable knight h7, their idea worked out when they were able to swap some pieces on the g5 square. It's just that black went a little crazy, or maybe it was just too ambitious with bishop takes h4. I think they saw this attack playing out better than it actually did. White has too many resources in the vicinity of their own king, and white showed good defensive prowess in making sure that black never got anything serious going towards white's king. And I believe after the queens were traded and more exchanges were made, black's only real chance to save this was to activate that pawn majority. And I was advocating doing that with, here on move 36, f6, looking to get the pawns in motion. And if black can distract white in that way, they've got a puncher's chance. It's not game over entirely. Okay, so thus concludes our analysis of these 8 games. Let's put a final strike through this one. I know this video turned out to be a very long video, so thank you to those who watched this straight through or maybe watched it in parts. I recorded this straight through. I didn't take any breaks, so I apologize if there's any mistakes. And thank you to Kevin, the Lichess 45+45 admin, for allowing me to do this. And also paying me a little bit to do this. Much appreciated. And hope you guys enjoyed this as well. Feel free to post any comments. Also, if you were one of the players in these games, chime in, let us know what you're thinking. And I hope to do this again sometime in the future. If you're interested in the league, I'll post the information to it. They all seem like good guys and ladies involved in this league. So if you're looking to get some serious games in, could be a nice way to do that. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoy your day. And as always, I'll be back again soon with more videos. Talk to you guys later. Bye.